What's good, everyone? This is Arcane Paradox, and boy do we have a treat for you. Ancient Goblin Treaty Scan found Harry owned 22 Lordships and Dumbledore 39-year vault theft discovered. Hit subscribe and the bell. Let the story begin. Chapter 1, The Audit. The Owl arrived on a Tuesday, which Harry had always found to be the most aggressively unremarkable day of the week. He was in the kitchen of Grimmauld Place, standing at the stove in a t-shirt and old Quidditch shorts, deciding whether the eggs he'd cracked into the pan constituted breakfast or lunch. The windows were fogged with morning steam. Creature had left a pot of tea on the counter before disappearing. The old elf had developed a talent for vanishing the moment Harry looked like he might want company, and the wireless on the windowsill was playing something instrumental and forgettable that Harry hadn't bothered to change. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of morning that the post-war world had settled into being. He heard the tap before he saw it, a sharp, businesslike knock against the window glass, not the soft flutter of a regular owl. When he turned, the bird outside was enormous. Smoke gray, with amber eyes that held the particular brand of disdain that only very expensive owls seem to cultivate. It had a red ribbon tied to its leg. Not a Hogwarts ribbon, not ministry red. Something darker, almost burgundy, with a gold seal pressed into wax at the knot. Harry turned the stove off, crossed the kitchen, and opened the window. The owl didn't wait for him to untie the letter. It extended its leg with the air of something that had better places to be, let him remove the envelope, and then launched itself back into the grey London morning without waiting for a treat or even a moment of acknowledgement. Rude, Harry said, to no one. He looked at the envelope. Heavy cream stock, his name written in script so precise it looked engraved rather than written, Mr. H. J. Potter, and beneath it, a smaller line that gave him pause, Lord Heir of the ancient and noble house of Potter, and matters pertaining thereto. He hadn't seen that phrasing in a long time. Not since Sirius, and even then it had mostly appeared on the kind of official correspondence that Sirius had enjoyed ignoring. The seal on the back was Gringotts. But not the standard Gringotts crest, a bank draft seal, or account summary header, something older, with more detail. A set of scales and a sword crossed over a stone tablet, surrounded by script Harry recognized as early gobbledygook but couldn't read. He leaned against the counter and broke the seal. The letter was not long. Gringotts, in Harry's experience, did not write long letters. They wrote letters with the density of legal contracts and the warmth of tax documents, every word doing precise work, none of them wasted on atmosphere. This one read, Mr. Potter, you are formally requested to present yourself at Gringotts Bank, Diagon Alley, London, at your earliest convenience, and no later than Thursday the 14th at noon. This request is issued in accordance with the Goblin Wizard Treaty of 974 CE, Article 12, Subsection 4, Succession Rights and Mandatory Heir Notification. The matter concerns your accounts, your bloodline holdings, and several related discoveries arising from our current succession audit. The nature of these discoveries is such that they cannot be adequately communicated in writing, nor can they be delayed. You will be received by Director Ragnok personally. Gringotts Bank remains, as always, impartial in matters of law and wholly committed to the accurate management of all holdings entrusted to our care. Sharp Fong, Senior Account Manager. Harry read it twice. Then he read the part about Director Ragnok personally a third time, because that wasn't something that happened. Ragnok was the Goblin equivalent of a head of state. Harry had met him once, briefly, in the chaos following the war, a moment of tense, deliberate handshaking that had stood in for the much larger conversation that neither side had fully managed to have about the dragon and the vault break-in. Since then, Ragnok had communicated through intermediaries. Everyone did, with Ragnok. Harry set the letter on the counter. He looked at it for a moment. Then he went back to the stove, turned it on, and finished making his eggs, because whatever was waiting for him at Gringotts had apparently been waiting for a while, and it could wait 20 more minutes while he ate breakfast. Some things had changed about Harry Potter in the 2 years since the Battle of Hogwarts. He was quieter, for one, not in a wounded way, but in the way of someone who had learned to think before he spoke and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he liked thinking. He was more comfortable in his own skin, though he'd never have said so out loud. He was slightly taller, his hair was slightly worse, and he had developed a habit of morning tea that Hermione found deeply satisfying and Ron found genuinely alarming. But the most significant change, the one that hadn't come with any fanfare or obvious moment, was that Harry had simply stopped reacting. He used to be all reaction. Someone said jump and he was already in the air asking how high on the way up. Someone pointed him at a dark corridor and he ran down it because that was what you did when Voldemort was alive and people needed saving. Voldemort wasn't alive anymore. And while Harry remained, in the deepest part of himself, someone who would run toward danger on behalf of people he loved, he no longer ran toward anything automatically. He watched. He ate his eggs. He thought about it first. He flooded Hermione at 8:30. Her head appeared in the fireplace with the expression of someone who had already been awake for 3 hours and was only mildly surprised to see him. Harry. What's happened? Good morning to you too. It's 8:32 and you're using the flow instead of the mirror, which means you want to talk but you don't want to be seen properly yet. She tilted her head. What's happened? He held up the letter. She squinted. Can you bring it closer? He crouched down and held it by the fireplace. He heard the quality of her silence change, the kind of silence Hermione produced when she was reading quickly and processing even faster. Ragnok personally, she said. Yeah. That's unusual. Very. And the treaty citation, Article 12, subsection 4, that's the, hold on. There was a brief sound of movement, something being pulled from a shelf. He could picture her perfectly, her study, the one she'd carved out of her and Ron's flat in Islington, 3 walls of books and 1 wall of notes pinned in a system only she fully understood. The sound of pages. Succession rights and mandatory heir notification. That clause hasn't been invoked in, Harry, that clause was last invoked in 1612. Right. Which means whatever they found during this audit, is old enough that they needed to go back to a treaty written in 974 CE to have the legal standing to notify me about it. Another silence. This one was different, the kind Hermione reserved for problems that had just rearranged themselves into something larger than originally assessed. When are you going? She asked. Today. I'm not waiting until Thursday. I'll come with you. I was hoping you'd say that. Give me 40 minutes. Her head started to withdraw and then paused. Harry, eat something first. Already did. She looked briefly, genuinely pleased by this, and disappeared. Diagon Alley at 9 in the morning on a weekday had a particular quality to it, unhurried, slightly grey, populated by shopkeepers taking deliveries and a handful of early-rising customers who preferred to do their banking and potion ingredient shopping before the crowds arrived. The rebuilding after the war was mostly complete now, though if you knew where to look you could still find places where the stonework was slightly too new, the mortar slightly too clean, a shop sign slightly too freshly painted over a ghost of an older one. Harry walked through it with his hood up, not because he thought it would fool anyone but because he was in no mood for autographs at 9 in the morning. Hermione walked beside him with her bag over her shoulder and a copy of Magical Property Law, Ancient Statutes and Modern Application tucked under her arm, because of course she'd had a copy. She'd spent the fluoride over here in animated, slightly worried monologue about Article 12, while Harry had listened and asked the right questions and thought, quietly, that whatever was happening, it had been set in motion long before this morning. The entrance to Gringotts was exactly as imposing as it always was, white marble steps, bronze doors, the goblin guards in their scarlet and gold who watched everything with the flat attention of people who have been watching humans embarrass themselves for centuries and no longer find it interesting. One of them, as Harry approached, did something Harry had never seen a Gringotts door guard do in his life. He stepped forward and bowed. Not the shallow, perfunctory nod that counted as acknowledgement. A real bow, formal, deliberate, spine parallel to the ground. Harry stopped. The guard straightened. Mr. Potter. Director Ragnok is expecting you. Please follow. Hermione made a small sound beside him. He didn't look at her but he felt her stillness, the same thing he was feeling, a kind of recalibration. The world had just told them something, in that bow, that neither of them fully understood yet. Lead the way, Harry said. They were not taken to a teller window. They were not directed to one of the low-ceilinged meeting rooms where Gringotts usually handled private client business, those narrow, slightly airless rooms with a single desk and a single lamp and a goblin who made you feel vaguely like you'd done something wrong by having money. They were taken down. Through a door behind the main hall that Harry had walked past 100 times without registering, down a corridor that was wider and higher ceilinged than anything he'd seen in the public areas of the bank, lit by lanterns that burned with a steady, warm light that had nothing of the guttering quality of the ones in the upper halls. The stone here was older, really old, the kind of old that had worn itself smooth and settled into permanence, and carved with patterns along the baseboards and lintels that Harry recognized as similar to the ones on the wax seal of his letter. The guard stopped at a set of double doors, solid black iron, no visible handles, a single emblem at the center that Harry had to look at twice before his brain assembled it, a goblin face in profile, surrounded by the same crossed scales and sword from the seal. The doors opened on their own. The room inside was large. Not ostentatiously large, it wasn't a throne room or a ceremonial hall. It felt more like a war room, if a war room had been built underground by a civilization that had been keeping records since before England had a king. A long stone table occupied the center, covered in documents and scrolls and what Harry recognized, with a slight lurch, as vault ledgers, enormous, leather-bound, the kind of ledgers that contained not just numbers but the magical recording of every transaction, withdrawal, and deposit made against a vault account, verified by the magic of the vault itself and therefore impossible to falsify. There were 5 goblins already in the room. Harry recognized none of them except the one seated at the head of the table, who had the bearing of someone who had never in his life arranged himself for anyone else's comfort. Ragnok was old. Not elderly, old, in the way of things that have existed long enough to have accumulated a specific kind of authority that sits in the bones rather than the face. He was smaller than Harry but managed to occupy more of the room, somehow. His eyes were dark amber, sharp, and when they fixed on Harry as he entered they didn't do what most people's eyes did, they didn't soften, or widen, or take on that particular quality of awe or relief that Harry had become wearily familiar with in the 2 years since the war. Ragnok's eyes assessed. That was all. Measured, tallied, and reached a conclusion. "Mr. Potter," he said. His voice was a low rumble, the particular resonance of a goblin speaking English when they could speak 6 other languages that suited them better. "You came earlier than requested. The letter said no later than Thursday. It didn't say I had to wait that long." Something shifted at the corners of Ragnok's mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. "Sit down. Both of you." He glanced at Hermione without apparent surprise, which suggested he had expected her to come. "Miss Granger. Your reputation precedes you in ways you may not be aware of. I have a feeling that's going to be true of several things today," Hermione said pleasantly, and pulled out a chair. Harry sat beside her. The 5 other goblins remained standing, positioned, he realized, not as attendants but as witnesses. This was a formal proceeding of some kind, even if it looked like a meeting. Ragnok placed both hands flat on the table and let the silence hold for a moment, not uncomfortably, but with purpose, the way a person takes a breath before saying something that will change the shape of a conversation. "You are aware," he began, "that our senior elder, Goldtusk, passed 6 weeks ago." Harry had read about that in the Prophet. A brief mention, diplomatic and careful, noting Gringotts' loss and the bank's continuing operation under Director Ragnok. Yes. What the Prophet did not report, because it is not their business to know, is that Goldtusk's passing triggered a mandatory succession audit of all treaty-linked accounts and blood claim holdings. This is standard practice, not extraordinary. Goldtusk was the keeper of treaty compliance for 91 years. When a keeper passes, everything under their jurisdiction must be reviewed and re-verified. Ragnok paused. We did not expect to find anything unusual. These audits are, as a rule, tedious procedural confirmations. But you found something unusual, Harry said. We found several things unusual. Ragnok nodded to the goblin to his right, who slid a leather-bound folder down the table to Harry with the care of someone handling evidence. The first of these things concerns you directly. The second concerns you even more directly. We will begin with the first. Harry opened the folder. Inside was a document that was clearly very, very old. The paper was not paper at all but something closer to treated vellum, and the text was in 3 languages side by side, gobbledygook on the left, Latin in the center, and an archaic form of English on the right. At the top, in all 3 languages, the title was clear enough: Treaty of Magical Succession and Blood Right Holdings, ratified in the year of the Common Reckoning 974 CE, between the Goblin Nation and the 17 founding magical houses of Britain. Beneath it, in English, subsection 12, Rights of Dormant Heirship. In the event that a bloodline heir reaches majority without knowledge of their full inheritance due to disruption, conflict, or the interference of third parties, it falls to Gringotts Bank, as treaty witness and vault keeper, to conduct a full bloodline audit and ensure said heir is informed of the entirety of their lawful holdings, in accordance with Goblin law and the sacred trust of the vault keep. Harry read it. Then he looked up. Dormant heirship. Yes. Meaning holdings I didn't know about. More than you might expect, Ragnok said, and his voice carried something that Harry, watching carefully, thought was not quite satisfaction, and not quite regret, but something that lived between the two. Mr. Potter. You were aware, I assume, of the Potter family's status as an ancient and noble house. Yes. My vault, the Trust Vault, and the main Potter Vault. The vaults are the least of it, said the goblin who had passed the folder, who had a face like weathered granite and the manner of a man who delivers hard news for a living. Forgive me, Director. Ragnok gestured for him to continue. The Potter bloodline, Mr. Potter, carries legitimate claim, documented, treaty verified, magically binding claim, to 22 lordships. The room was very quiet. Hermione's quill, which she had produced at some point without Harry noticing, stopped moving above her parchment. 22, Harry said. 22, confirmed the granite-faced goblin. 12 in Britain. For in what is now France, originating with the Peveril line through conquest rights granted at the Treaty of Califort in 1139. 3 in Ireland through the Fleamont-Cavendish maternal line, 3 generations back. 2 in Scotland through the ancient Potter alliance with the House of Macboon, predating the Statute of Secrecy. 1 in Germany, through a blood adoption completed in 1678 that was never formally dissolved. Harry did not say anything. The majority of these, Ragnok said, have been in abeyance, legally suspended, not dissolved, for between 40 and 300 years, due to the absence of a known, living, majority-age heir who had formally claimed them. The magic held them in trust. Waiting. And the treaty audit found them, Harry said. The treaty audit confirmed what the magic had always known. Your blood activated certain resonance markers during our scan, a standard part of the succession protocol. 7 of the 22 lit immediately upon your account being opened for audit. The others required deeper cross-referencing. Ragnok's amber eyes hadn't left Harry's face. We spent 3 weeks verifying before sending that letter. We do not make errors of this magnitude. Harry sat back. He looked at the treaty document again, at the old ink, the careful script, the signatures at the bottom in a dozen different languages, some of which weren't human. He thought, distantly, that he should be feeling overwhelmed, and was faintly surprised to find that he wasn't. He felt instead the quiet, particular clarity of someone who has been handed a truth that they didn't know they were missing but which, now present, makes perfect sense of everything around it. You said, Harry said carefully, that the first discovery concerns me directly. Which means the second discovery concerns me even more. He looked at Ragnok. What's the second thing? Ragnok was quiet for a moment. It was the first time in the meeting that he had paused before speaking, and the quality of that pause was different, waited, in the way of a man choosing how to deliver something he has thought about very carefully. He reached across the table himself, not through an intermediary, and placed a second folder in front of Harry. This one was newer. The paper was modern. The records inside were Gringotts ledger copies, officially stamped, each page bearing the Vault Magic verification seal that made them legally admissible in any court, magical or goblin. Harry opened it. He looked at the first page for a long moment. Then he turned to the second. The third. He went slowly, not because he didn't understand what he was reading, but because he wanted to be absolutely sure he understood it correctly before he said anything out loud. Hermione made a quiet, involuntary sound. He glanced at her and saw that she had leaned over to read the same pages and her face had gone the careful, deliberate blank that meant she was working very hard to keep her expression neutral. The records were withdrawals. Potter Vault withdrawals, not the Trust Vault, the main vault. Going back 39 years. Regular, methodical, documented in the Vault ledger in the way that all Vault transactions were documented, who authorized it, under what instrument of authority, and where the funds went. The authorizing name on every single withdrawal, from 39 years ago to 4 years ago, was the same. Authorized by APWB Dumbledore. Instrument, Magical Guardian Authority, designated January 11, 1981. Harry closed the folder. "How much?" he said. His voice was perfectly level. "In gold alone," Ragnok said, 4,200,000 galleons over the 39-year period. That is the cash figure. It does not include the magical artifacts removed under the same authority, 47 items, catalogued in the third section of that folder. It does not include the redirect of income from 2 of your dormant lordship estates, which continued to generate revenue that was rerouted away from your holdings and into accounts we are still tracing. And it does not include," Ragnok stopped, and for the first time Harry thought he saw something in the goblin's expression that might, at a stretch, be called anger, "the interest that accrued on your vaults during the years when the gold should have been there, compounding, which it was not." 4,000,000 galleons, Hermione said quietly. "Approximately." Ragnok folded his hands. "We are still completing the full accounting." Harry looked at the closed folder on the table in front of him. He thought about Dumbledore, about the man he knew, the one with the half-moon glasses and the lemon drops and the gentle voice that always managed to make you feel like the conversation you were having with him was the most important one he'd had all year. He thought about the years of it, 17 years of being steered and guided and positioned and protected, and all the while, underneath all of it, this. "The Magical Guardian Authority," Harry said. "He was appointed my guardian after my parents died." "The instrument is dated the 1st of November, 1981, Ragnok confirmed. "The day after." "Who appointed him?" Ragnok met his eyes steadily. "That is one of the more interesting questions arising from this audit, Mr. Potter. Magical Guardian Authority for the heir of an ancient and noble house cannot, under wizarding law, be assigned by anything less than a full Wisengamot decree. We have found no record of such a decree." The silence in the room had a different quality now. "He appointed himself," Hermione said, and her voice had gone very quiet and very careful, the way it did when she had found something that she deeply, genuinely did not want to have found. "We cannot make that determination," Ragnok said precisely. "What we can say is that the instrument of authority in our records is dated, signed by Dumbledore as both grantor and recipient, and bears no counter-signature from the Wisengamot, the Ministry, or any other Potter family representative. The legality of the instrument is, at minimum, deeply questionable. The withdrawals made under it are, potentially," he paused, and selected his word with obvious care, "prosecutable." Harry stood up. Not abruptly, he pushed back his chair and stood the way a person does when they need to think standing up, slowly and with purpose. He walked to the end of the room, not far, just enough to have a moment of space, and stood with his hands in his pockets looking at the ancient stone of the far wall. He was 20 years old. He had fought a war when he was 17, and before that he'd spent 7 years being shunted from crisis to crisis like a piece on a board, always in motion, always reactive, always pointed somewhere by someone else's hand. He'd always thought, when he allowed himself to think about it at all, that Dumbledore's management of him had been difficult and sometimes painful, but ultimately the choices of a man who loved him and had a plan. He was looking at documented evidence that the man with the plan had, within 24 hours of his parents' deaths, given himself legal authority over the Potter accounts. And then used it for 39 years. There was a very old grief in that. He let himself feel it, standing with his back to the room, for exactly as long as it needed. Then he turned around. "I want the full accounting," he said. "Everything, gold, artifacts, diverted estate income, interest. I want the legal analysis of the guardian instrument. I want the list of the 22 lordships with everything currently attached to each one, properties, assets, magical bindings, obligations." He looked at Ragnok. "And I want to understand what Gringotts' position is in all of this. Because you could have buried this audit result. Instead you sent me that letter. I'd like to know why." It was, he knew, the right question to ask. He could see it in the way Ragnok regarded him, a recalibration, the amber eyes reassessing. "Gringotts," Ragnok said, "does not bury audit results. We are bound by the treaty to disclose to the heir. That is law, not choice." He paused. "However, you ask about our position, and I will be transparent with you, because I find transparency useful in relationships of this kind. Gringotts failed you, Mr. Potter. We permitted withdrawals under an instrument of authority that should have required Wisengamot verification. We did not flag the absence of that verification for 39 years. Whether that failure was incompetence or something else, another deliberate pause, is part of what we are currently investigating internally. What I can tell you is that Gringotts' interests and your interests, in this matter, are aligned. We want the legal record corrected. We want the appropriate remedies applied. And we want it made absolutely clear, to every account holder, every institution, and every government body that interacts with this bank, that Goblin Vault law is not something that can be navigated around by a clever piece of paperwork." Harry looked at him for a long moment. "Then we want the same things," Harry said. Ragnok inclined his head. The closest he had come to a bow. "We will prepare the full documentation. It will take several days. I'll come back Friday morning." Harry picked up both folders from the table. He held them up slightly. "With your permission. They were prepared for you to take." He tucked them under his arm. He looked at Hermione, who had filled 4 pages of parchment and was watching him with an expression he recognized, not worry, not sympathy, but the sharp, focused attention she got when she was 3 steps ahead and running calculations. It was the most comforting expression she owned. "Ready?" he asked. "I've been ready since the treaty citation," she said, and stood up, smoothing her robes. Harry turned back to Ragnok one last time. "One question. The 47 artifacts removed from the vault. Do you have a record of where they went? Where they are now?" Ragnok's expression was impossible to read. "Some of them, yes. Several were redistributed, donated, in Dumbledore's name, to wizarding institutions and museums. Several we have been unable to trace." A pause. "And several, Mr. Potter, are currently residing in Hogwarts Castle." Harry nodded. He let that land, felt the weight of it settle. "Friday morning," he said. "Thank you, Director." He walked out of the room with Hermione half a step behind him and the 2 folders under his arm, and neither of them spoke until they were back up through the old stone corridor and through the door and into the grand marble hall of the bank with its high ceilings and its rows of tellers and its busy Tuesday morning normalcy. Then Hermione said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "Harry. I know. He was your guardian before you even went to the Dursleys. Before you even knew you were a wizard. I know. That means he had access to everything while you were growing up. The whole time." "Hermione." He stopped walking. He looked at her. "I know. I'm not falling apart. I need to think. He shifted the folders. I need you to help me think. She looked at him for a moment, that same sharp attention, and then something in her face softened into something more honest. He was my hero, she said, and the past tense of it cost her something visible. I need a moment with that. Take it, he said simply. Then help me figure out what to do next. She took a breath. Held it. Let it out. Straightened. Right, she said. We'll need Ron. Ron, yes. And Neville. She frowned slightly. Neville. Harry thought about the treaty document, the 17 founding houses, the web of alliances and blood claims and dormant lordships, the name Macboon on the Scottish connection, which he had recognized not from history class but from a conversation with Neville 2 years ago about his grandmother's obsessive family record-keeping. Neville, he said. I'll explain on the way. They walked out into the grey Diagon Alley morning, past the shopkeepers taking in their deliveries and the early rising customers with their lists, past the slightly too new stonework and the slightly too fresh paint, and Harry thought about Dumbledore, about the office above the moving staircases and the portraits and the lemon drops and the careful management of every conversation they had ever had, and he thought about 39 years and 4 million galleons and a magical Guardian authority signed with no counter-signature, on the day after Halloween, 1981. The folders were heavy under his arm. He walked through it all with his hood up and his chin level, and he wasn't afraid, and he wasn't overwhelmed, and he wasn't looking for someone to tell him what to do. He was thinking. For the first time in his life, with no war to fight and no prophecy to fulfill and no Dumbledore looking over his shoulder with gentle eyes and a plan Harry didn't know about, he was just thinking, clearly and completely, about exactly what he intended to do next. It felt, he thought, rather like landing after a very long flight and finally getting to feel the ground under your feet. He held the folders a little tighter. And he walked. Chapter 2, 22 Ron's reaction, upon being told, was to sit very still for approximately 4 seconds and then say, 4 million? They were in Hermione's study in Islington, which had been the obvious choice. It was the only room any of them owned that had enough wall space for everything Hermione had already started pinning up before Harry and Ron had even arrived. She'd been at it for 2 hours by the time Ron came through the flue, still in his work robes from the Auror office, smelling faintly of the particular kind of paperwork that involved magical evidence seals. 4,200,000, Hermione said, not looking up from the ledger copy she was cross-referencing against her notes. Approximately. They're still calculating. Ron looked at Harry. Harry was sitting on the edge of Hermione's desk eating an apple, because he'd realized somewhere around 3 o'clock that he'd had nothing since the eggs that morning and his body had begun lodging formal complaints. How are you that calm? I'm not calm, Harry said. I'm hungry. There's a difference. You look calm. I look like someone who decided somewhere between Gringotts and here that the most useful thing I can do right now is think clearly, which I can't do if I'm throwing things. He took another bite of the apple. I did consider throwing something, for the record. I thought about it for quite a while on the walk back. Ron absorbed this. He pulled a chair out from the small table Hermione had shoved against the far wall to make room for her pinboard, turned it backwards, and sat astride it with his arms folded across the back. His expression was doing several things at once, the particular kind of Weasley anger that ran hot and fast and honest, and underneath it, the same thing Harry had seen on Hermione's face in the bank. The grief of a specific kind of disillusionment. It's Dumbledore, Ron said, not as a question. Every withdrawal. 39 years. He died 2 years ago. The withdrawals stopped 4 years ago. Which means they stopped while he was still alive. Hermione finally looked up. Which is interesting, isn't it? Because 4 years ago, the war was escalating, Harry said. He was focused elsewhere. He paused. Or he thought it was almost over, one way or another, and there wasn't much point. The room held that thought for a moment. Ron rubbed a hand over his face. Does it change anything? About what he did? During the war? Any of it? It was exactly the right question, Harry thought, and exactly the question he'd been sitting with all afternoon. I don't know yet, he said honestly. I'm not ready to answer that. What I know is what the ledgers show, and I'm not going to decide what it means until I know everything it means. He set the apple core aside. Which is why I need Neville. Ron frowned. You mentioned that to Hermione. Why Neville specifically? Harry reached for the treaty document, the photocopy Gringotts had provided, the original remaining in their vaults, and found the page he'd been thinking about since the walk from Diagon Alley. He slid it across the desk to Ron. Ron looked at the section Harry had marked. His eyebrows climbed. The House of MacBoon. Cross-reference it against the Longbottom family tree, Harry said. The maternal line. Neville's gran has been obsessive about family records his whole life. He mentioned it once, I think it was 6th year, something about his gran making him memorize descent lines as punishment. Hermione stepped forward and pointed to something on her pinboard, a hand-drawn web of family connections she'd constructed from memory and 2 reference books she'd pulled from the shelves. The MacBoon Longbottom connection runs through Augusta Longbottom's mother's side. The House of MacBoon was considered extinct, no living male heir, but if the succession runs through the maternal line, which under Scottish wizarding law it absolutely can, then Neville has a claim, Ron finished. He looked at Harry. Does he know? I'd be surprised if he does, Harry said. I don't think the audit that found my lordships would have extended to the Longbottom accounts. This was specifically triggered by the Potter bloodline markers. But if I'm walking into whatever comes next with 22 lordships behind me, he stopped. I'd rather walk in with Neville beside me. Ron was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once, with the particular decisiveness he showed when he'd assessed a situation and committed to a position. It was the chess player in him, once he saw the board clearly, he moved without hesitation. I'll get him, Ron said. He's at the Longbottom greenhouses today. I know because he complained about it this morning, something about a shipment of Dittany that came in wrong. I'll come with you, Harry said. You'll stay here, Hermione said pleasantly, in the tone that meant it wasn't actually a suggestion, and read the artifacts section of that folder, which neither of us has properly gone through yet and which I suspect is going to be significantly worse than the gold. Harry looked at her. She looked back with the expression of someone holding a very firm position. Fine, Harry said. Ron was already at the floor. The artifacts section was, as Hermione had predicted, significantly worse than the gold. Not all 47 items were significant on their own. Some were pieces of Potter family history, ceremonial objects, enchanted heirlooms, things with sentimental weight but limited practical power. Harry moved through those entries methodically, building a list, keeping his face neutral. But several stopped him. Item 17, 1, Lordship Signet Ring, Potter-Peverell Alliance, enchanted silver with embedded bloodstone, removed March 14, 1984. Current location, unknown. Harry set that one aside and kept reading. Item 23, 1, Bound Grimoire, Potter Family Magical Lineage Records, hand-inscribed, pre-1500. Removed July 9, 1979. Current location, Hogwarts Library, restricted section, misfiled under the Dumbledore donation catalog of 1979. He read that one twice. The grimoire had been removed in 1979. 2 years before his parents died. Which meant the access hadn't begun with the Guardian Authority instrument. It had begun before that. He wrote 1979 on a piece of parchment and circled it. Item 31, 1, Enchanted Mirror, purpose classified, Black Potter Provenance, removed December 22, 1981. Current location, Hogwarts Castle, Headmaster's private quarters. Item 38, 1, Sealed Correspondence Packet, Lily J. Potter to James C. Potter, dated October 1981, contents unknown. Removed February 11, 1981. Current location, unknown. Harry put that page down. He picked it up again. He read item 38 one more time. A sealed correspondence packet. His mother's letters. Removed the day after she died. He thought about that for a long, careful moment, what it would mean, what letters written in October 1981 might contain, what his mother might have written to his father in the month before Voldemort came to Godric's Hollow. He thought about all the things he'd never known about her, all the things that had been preserved in objects and letters and records that had been quietly removed from his life before he was old enough to ask questions. He set the list down. He stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the Islington street below, ordinary, muggle, grey-skied, and he breathed, slowly, until the anger settled into something more useful. By the time the flue flared 20 minutes later and Ron came through followed by Neville Longbottom in greenhouse clothes, dragon-hide gloves still hanging from his back pocket, traces of soil on his forearms, Harry had the list organized, his notes written, and his face arranged into something that communicated serious situation without communicating I've been standing at the window trying not to be furious. Neville looked at the pinboard, at Hermione's papers, at Harry's notes, and at Harry's face, in that order. "What's happened?" he said. The thing about Neville, the thing that Harry had appreciated more and more in the 2 years since the war, was that he had no performance in him. None at all. He'd grown up enough to be comfortable with himself, comfortable with what the war had made of him, comfortable in the considerable physical presence he'd grown into, but none of that had translated into the kind of self-consciousness that made people perform reactions instead of just having them. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. He asked 3 questions, all of them sharp, practical, directed at the specific points that mattered rather than the sensational ones. When Harry got to the part about the Macboon connection and the Longbottom maternal line, Neville went very still in the way of someone who is hearing something they already half knew but hadn't let themselves think through. "Gran's always said there were old claims that never got filed properly," he said quietly, when Harry finished. "Did she say what kind of claims?" "Lordship rights. She called them dormant honors. The way she said it, I always thought she meant it as a family grievance. Like the kind of thing people bring up at family dinners to feel important." He paused. "She's not wrong, is she?" "She is extremely not wrong," Hermione said. "If the Macboon succession passes through the maternal line, and under Scottish wizarding law there's strong precedent, then you have at minimum 2 Scottish lordship claims, and potentially 3 depending on how the Longbottom main line's British holdings interact with the treaty framework." Neville absorbed this. He looked at Harry. "This is about more than the lordships, though." "Yes," Harry said. "It's about Dumbledore. The ledgers don't show anything against Longbottom accounts, the audit was specifically triggered by the Potter bloodline markers. But once you start looking at the treaty framework and the way the Guardian Authority instrument was constructed," Harry stopped. "I want to be honest with you, Neville. I'm not asking you to stand next to me because of what you might be owed. I'm asking because whatever comes next is going to be big and complicated and I'd rather do it with someone I trust beside me than alone." Neville was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled the dragon-hide gloves from his back pocket and set them on the table, with the deliberate quality of someone setting something down for good. "Tell me what you need," he said. Friday came with a cold rain that made Diagon Alley look like a watercolor someone had left out in the weather. Harry arrived at Gringotts at 8:30, 30 minutes early, because he was done with the habit of showing up exactly when other people expected him. He had spent the days between in a focused, methodical way that surprised him slightly. He'd always assumed that if someone ever handed him evidence of this magnitude he'd move fast and loud, the way he'd always moved through crises. Instead he found himself slowing down, going through everything twice, writing questions in the margins of documents and then going back and writing answers. Hermione had helped. Ron had made tea at regular intervals and served the function that Ron had always served best, which was to say plainly what everyone else was dancing around, loudly enough that it couldn't be ignored. It had been Ron who had said, on Wednesday evening, "You know you're going to have to go and see him eventually." "Dumbledore." "I know. Not eventually. Soon. Before this gets to anyone else, before the Wisengamot or the Ministry or the Prophet gets wind of any of it, you need to have that conversation. Because if the story breaks before you do, he controls the framing. Harry had looked at him. Ron had shrugged with the particular expression of someone who has spent 2 years training as an Auror and has learned to think about information as a tactical resource. He's still the most respected man in the magical world, Ron had said. That's still true. Whatever else is true, that's also true. You can't ignore it. I'm not ignoring it, Harry had said. I'm just not doing it before I have everything. Everything, as it turned out, was in the folders waiting for him on the conference room table when Ragnok's assistant let him in on Friday morning. 3 folders this time, supplemented by a leather satchel that contained the vault ledger copies he would need for any legal proceeding. Hermione took a seat beside Harry. Neville sat on his other side, a fact that Ragnok acknowledged with a measured look that suggested he had done his research in the intervening days. Mr. Longbottom, Ragnok said. We have been conducting a supplementary review since Mr. Potter's visit on Tuesday. You have been added to the notification list for related bloodline findings. Neville nodded. I was told to expect that. Good. Ragnok looked at Harry. Shall we proceed? Please. The full accounting took 2 hours. Ragnok's team, the 5 goblins from Tuesday plus 2 others, walked them through it with the meticulous precision of people who had spent 3 days preparing a presentation they expected to be scrutinized legally, which it would be. Harry listened to all of it. He asked questions when he needed clarification. He didn't interrupt. The final gold figure, including diverted estate income and compounded interest on the missing amounts, was 6,800,000 galleons. Hermione wrote it in large numbers at the top of her parchment and underlined it twice. Then came the part Harry had been waiting for. Mr. Potter, said Sharp Fong, the granite-faced goblin from Tuesday, we are prepared to begin the formal lordship claiming process at any time you are ready. I should inform you that there is a physical component to this process that I want to prepare you for. The rings, Harry said. A slight pause. You've researched the process. Hermione researched the process. I listened while she explained it. Hermione, to her credit, did not look smug. Lordship rings, she said, for ancient and noble houses, particularly ones with goblin-forged bloodline magic, require the heir to physically claim them. The ring recognizes the blood. If the heir is the genuine claimant, the ring bonds to them. If not, she glanced at Sharp Fong. If not, Sharp Fong said, the ring does nothing. It is simply metal. He looked at Harry. You will not have that problem. They took him to a different room entirely, smaller, more private, carved from black stone that had a faint warmth to it that Harry noticed immediately and thought felt like old magic, the kind that had been sitting in one place long enough to become part of the place itself. A stone pedestal at the center. On it, arranged in careful rows, 22 rings. Harry stood in the doorway and looked at them. They were not flashy. That was the first thing he registered. He'd half expected something dramatic, gold and rubies and goblin craftsmanship that announced itself. Some of them were that, a few of the older ones with heraldic stones and heavy settings. But most were simpler. A carved band with a seal. A plain silver ring with one word inscribed on the inside. A dark metal ring that looked almost black and absorbed the light in the room rather than reflecting it. 22 pieces of his family's history, sitting on a stone pedestal in a room underground, waiting. Harry stepped forward and picked up the first one, the Potter ring, the one he recognized, because he'd seen it in a portrait of his grandfather once. Heavy gold, the Potter crest, a ruby in the center. He held it for a moment and felt it, the warmth of old magic recognizing something it had been waiting for, and slid it onto the index finger of his right hand. The room lit up. Not dramatically, not with a lightning strike or a sound or a sudden wind, the way magic announced itself in stories. A warm pulse of golden light that originated from the ring and moved through Harry like a deep breath, like something settling into place that had been slightly wrong for a very long time. It faded in seconds and left behind a comfortable weight on his finger and the distinct sense of something having been formally acknowledged. Sharpfang nodded. As expected. Proceed. The Peveril ring was second. Older than the Potter ring by several centuries, the setting simpler, a flat oval of dark stone engraved with the Deathly Hallows symbol, which Harry recognized with a jolt of something complicated. He picked it up. The magic of it was different, quieter, deeper, more patient. It had been waiting longer. He put it on. The claiming went on for an hour. Not every ring was comfortable. Some of them pushed back, not against Harry himself but against the weight of their dormancy, like stiff hinges opening for the first time in decades or centuries. The Macboon ring, which was, as Harry had suspected, tangled in the Longbottom Treaty claims, actually made a sound when he picked it up, a low resonant tone like a struck bell, and Sharpfang looked sharply at his colleagues and said something fast in gobbledygook that Harry didn't catch. The French lordship rings felt different from the British ones, lighter, somehow, as if the magic that had forged them had a different quality, a different accent. The German ring was a thin black band that, when Harry slid it on, produced a pulse not of gold but of deep violet that faded almost too fast to see. By the end of it Harry was wearing 8 rings, the others would come later, spaced for the magic to properly settle, Sharpfang explained, and his right hand felt heavy and warm and alive with old magic recognizing itself. He stood up from the stone bench where he'd been sitting for the last half of the process and held his hand out, looking at the rings. There was no way to be casual about 22 lordships. There was no way to make it feel like a normal Tuesday morning development. But there was also, Harry found, no part of him that wanted to shrink from it. Hermione was watching him from just inside the doorway. Her expression was careful, attentive, looking for signs of something going wrong. When their eyes met and she read whatever was on his face, something in hers relaxed. "How do you feel?" she asked. Harry turned his hand over. Looked at the rings. "Like I'm carrying something that was always supposed to be mine," he said. "Just that." Neville was quieter than usual on the walk back to the conference room, and when Harry glanced at him, he was looking at the Macboon information packet he'd been handed and doing the particular brand of stillness that meant he was deciding something rather than thinking about something. In the conference room, Harry sat down and looked at Ragnok. "There's something else," Harry said. "Item 38 in the artifacts list. A sealed correspondence packet, my mother's letters, removed the day after she died." He kept his voice level. "I want to know everything Gringotts knows about where it might be." Ragnok's expression was impossible to read, but he held Harry's gaze. "We have reason to believe the packet is among the items currently held at Hogwarts. We cannot confirm its precise location without access to the castle's holdings, which requires authorization we do not currently possess." "That will change," Harry said simply. He looked down at the rings on his hand. "As the holder of 22 lordship claims, including several that predate Hogwarts' founding charter, what standing do I have to request access?" The silence in the room shifted in a way that suggested the goblins around the table had not expected that particular question in quite that form, delivered quite so quickly. Sharpfang leaned toward Ragnok and said something low. Ragnok's expression moved through several things in rapid succession before settling on something that was not quite a smile but was definitely pointed. "Under the Treaty of 974, Ragnok said, a peer of the realm carrying 4 or more active lordship claims, and particularly any claim that predates an institution's founding, may petition for access to that institution's holdings for the purpose of recovering treaty-protected hereditary property." A pause. "You currently have 8 active claims, Mr. Potter. The remaining 14 will activate over the next several weeks. So I have standing." "Considerable standing." Harry nodded. "Good." He closed the last folder. "Let's talk about the legal process for the theft claim. Because I want everything in order before I go to Dumbledore." The room was very still for a moment. "You intend to confront him directly," Ragnok said. "I intend to speak to him." "Yes. Before any Wisengamot involvement?" I think he deserves to hear it from me first, Harry said. What comes after is what comes after. But he and I are going to have a conversation before any of this becomes a public matter. He said it without anger, without the performance of controlled rage that would have been easy in this moment and would have told the room that he was running on emotion. He said it the way you state a fact about what you're going to do, simply, with absolute certainty. Ragnok studied him. And if he attempts to manage the narrative after your conversation? If he contacts the Wisengamot or the Ministry before you have the chance to, he won't, Harry said. How can you be certain? Because he'll know I have the documentation. And Dumbledore, Harry paused, thinking about the man, the whole complicated architecture of him. Dumbledore does not move in panicked straight lines. He thinks in long games. He'll want time to construct a response. He'll think he has it. Harry met Ragnok's amber eyes. He doesn't. But he won't know that yet. Another silence. This one had a different quality, the quality of people around a table reassessing the person across from them. Neville spoke for the first time in a while. I want to be there, he said. When you go to Dumbledore. Harry looked at him. You don't have to be. I know I don't have to be. Neville folded the MacBoon information packet with precise, deliberate movements and tucked it inside his jacket. But if he spent 39 years operating under the assumption that the people whose interests he was managing would never figure out what he'd done, then I think two of us showing up, together, is more useful than one. He looked at Harry steadily. Besides, if your bloodline claims are as entangled with mine as the treaty suggests, whatever you're walking into next, I'm already part of it. Harry held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. One more thing, Hermione said, which were 3 words that the people who loved Hermione Granger had learned over the years meant brace yourself, because this is the part I've been working up to. She opened her own folder, the one she'd brought from Islington, dense with her own notes and cross-references, to a page near the back. The 1979 removal. Item 23. The Potter family grimoire. What about it? Harry said. It was removed 2 years before your parents died. Under what authority? The Guardian instrument was only created on the 1st of November, 1981, we've confirmed that. So in 1979, Dumbledore had no formal instrument of access to the Potter vaults at all. The room was very quiet. He broke into the vault, Ron said. He'd been sitting at the end of the table, quiet for most of the last hour, running through the ledger copies with aura-trained eyes. In 1979, he just went in without authorization. Not broke in, exactly, Sharp Fong said, with the careful expression of a man about to admit something that reflected poorly on his institution. A vault access under Dumbledore's name is recorded in 1979 for item 23. What we cannot immediately explain is how that access was authorized. We are investigating. He had someone on the inside, Ron said. Not asking. Sharp Fong said nothing. Which was, Harry thought, its own kind of answer. So the question, Hermione said, isn't just what he took and when he took it. The question is how much access he had before 1981, and what he was looking for. Harry looked at the date he'd written on his parchment 2 days ago. 1979, circled. His parents had been in hiding from 1981. Before that they'd been fighting in the First War. In 1979 his mother had been 20 years old, his father 21, young, brilliant, already significant enough in the magical world that someone had wanted their family records. He thought about what was in a family grimoire. Bloodline records. Magical ancestry. The full account of a family's gifts, their hereditary magic, their alliances, and their vulnerabilities. The kind of information that, if you were building a long game, you would want before anything else. Before anything else. He thought about that for a long time, sitting in the black stone room underground with the rings warm on his hand and the documentation spread across the table and his 2 best friends and Neville beside him. There was a shape forming from all of this, not just theft, not just opportunistic exploitation of Guardian authority. Something with more deliberate architecture. He couldn't see all of it yet. He needed the grimoire. He needed his mother's letters. He needed the conversation with Dumbledore. But the shape was there, and he was beginning to understand its edges. He gathered his folders. He stood up. He looked at Ragnok. "Thank you," he said. "For all of it. I know this was a difficult audit to deliver." Ragnok's amber eyes held his. "Gringotts protects what is entrusted to us, Mr. Potter. In this case we failed that trust for 39 years. The least we can do is correct the record." A pause. "We will have the additional claiming documentation ready for the remaining 14 lordships within the fortnight." Harry nodded. He turned to his friends. "Right," he said. "We need to go to Hogwarts." Ron blinked. Today. Today. The grimoire is in the restricted section. I have standing to request it." Harry looked down at his right hand, at the rings, the weight of them, the warm magic of them. "And I'm done waiting." "Harry," Hermione said, "if you walk into Hogwarts with 8 active lordship rings and request access to a grimoire that Dumbledore put there without authorization, the castle is going to react to you. The magic of the place, the wards, they recognize lordship claims that predate the founding." "I know," Harry said. "Which means McGonagall is going to know something unusual is happening the moment you step through the gates." "Also fine," Harry said. Hermione studied him. "You want her to know." "I want her to have a chance to be on the right side of this before it gets to a point where her choices are made for her," Harry said. "She deserves that." A moment of silence. Then Hermione closed her own folder, picked up her bag, and stood. "Then we're going to Hogwarts," she said. Neville was already on his feet. Ron capped his quill and set it down with the air of a man who had known, since approximately Tuesday morning, that his week was going to look like this. "I'll send Ginny a message," Ron said, pulling out his communication mirror. "She'll want to know." "What should I tell her?" Harry asked. Ron glanced at the rings, at the folders, at the expression on Harry's face that said everything without saying anything. "I'll just tell her it started," Ron said. "She'll understand." Harry walked out of Gringotts into the cold Diagon Alley rain with his right hand in his pocket, feeling the weight of 22 claims against his fingers, and thought that Ron was right. It had started. And for the first time in a long time, Harry Potter was the one deciding where it went next. Chapter 3, The conversation. Hogwarts in late autumn had a specific quality of light that Harry had never found anywhere else, the way the sky over the lake went the color of old pewter in the late afternoon, the way the castle's windows caught what little sun remained and held it longer than they should have, as if the stones themselves were reluctant to let the day go. He'd forgotten how much he'd missed it, standing at the gates with the cold rain softening to a drizzle and the castle rising above the grounds in that way it had of looking both impossibly ancient and entirely familiar. The gates opened before he touched them. Not the slow, reluctant creak of iron recognizing a visitor. They swung wide and smooth, both panels at once, with the kind of authority that suggested the castle's enchantments had consulted something deeper than the standard visitor ward and reached a conclusion. Ron said nothing. Neville was watching the gates with his head slightly tilted, the expression of a man who studies magical plants for a living and therefore has a fine-tuned sensitivity to the behavior of living magic. Hermione had her hand on her bag strap and was looking at Harry with the sharp, focused attention she'd been wearing since Gringotts. Harry walked through first. The moment he crossed the wards, the precise instant his foot touched the stone path inside the boundary, he felt it. A deep resonant pulse that moved through the ground and up through his legs and into his chest, something old and enormous and aware, like a vast intelligence registering his presence and updating an ancient record somewhere in its depths. The rings on his hand warmed all at once. The castle, in some fundamental way that had nothing to do with windows or walls or architecture, noticed him. "The wards know the rings," Hermione said quietly, walking beside him. "I expected it, but that's something to witness." "Can you feel it?" Neville asked. "Yes," Harry said. They were halfway up the path to the main doors when those doors opened, and Minerva McGonagall stepped out. She was in teaching robes, a stack of parchments under one arm that she'd clearly abandoned mid-marking. Her expression caught somewhere between the authoritative composure she'd maintained through a war and something more unguarded, an alert, attentive look that Harry recognized from the handful of times in his life that something had genuinely surprised her. She looked at Harry. At his right hand. Back at his face. "Mr. Potter," she said, and her voice carried its usual precision but also something underneath it, the quality of a woman who has felt the castle's wards respond from inside and has come to see for herself what they responded to. "This is unexpected." "I'm sorry to come without more notice," Harry said. "I hope we're not interrupting anything critical." "You opened the gates without a key." "The gates opened," Harry said. "I just walked through." She looked at him for a long moment, with the steady, measuring gaze that had assessed students across a desk for 40 years and rarely reached wrong conclusions. Then she stepped back and held the door wider. "Come inside," she said. "All of you. You'll want tea, I imagine." "We'll want the restricted section," Harry said, "but tea first would be good." Her office was the same as it had always been, or almost the same, because it was no longer Dumbledore's office and had never quite felt like his, even when he occupied it. McGonagall had taken down several of the more ostentatious portraits, rearranged the furniture to something more functional, and added 3 additional bookshelves that made the room feel simultaneously more lived in and more serious. Dumbledore's desk remained, too significant a piece of furniture to remove, but she'd cleared everything off its surface except a single lamp and whatever she'd been working on when the gates triggered. The sorting hat was in its corner. Several portraits dozed or pretended to. Harry noticed, on the wall behind the desk, that Dumbledore's portrait frame was present but currently empty, the painted figure absent in the way that portraits sometimes were when their subjects chose not to be observed. Harry filed that away. McGonagall poured tea herself, not magically, with a gesture, but physically, which was, Harry had always thought, more characteristically her. She set cups in front of each of them, took her own behind the desk, and sat down. "The wards responded to you the way they respond to a founder's heir," she said. Straight to it, no preamble. He'd always appreciated that about her. "I've been the keeper of these wards for 2 years and I've never felt them move like that for a visitor. Several of my bloodline claims predate the founding," Harry said. "Apparently the castle's enchantments have a longer memory than most records suggest." Her eyes moved to his right hand, where 3 of the rings were visible, the Potter ring, the Peveril, and the MacBoon. She was too controlled to visibly react, but something shifted in her expression, the particular movement of a very intelligent person absorbing new information and rapidly restructuring their understanding around it. "How many?" she asked. 22 claims total. 8 currently active." Silence. The lamp on the desk cast a warm pool of light. Rain tapped against the high windows. "When?" she said. Just the one word, but loaded with the full weight of what it was really asking. "When did you find out, and how, and what does it mean that you're here?" "Gringotts, Tuesday," Harry said. "Succession audit triggered by Goldtusk's death. The treaty scan found dormant bloodline claims, they've been in abeyance since before I was born." He paused. "The audit also found other things." He watched her. She held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who has lived long enough to know that the sentences that end with other things are the ones that matter. "What kind of other things?" she said. Harry reached into the satchel he'd carried from Gringotts and placed one of the ledger copies on her desk. He didn't push it toward her, didn't make a production of it. Just placed it where she could see it if she chose to. She looked at it without picking it up. He watched her read the page he'd left visible, the summary page, the authorizing name on every withdrawal, the dates running back 39 years. She was very still. The quality of stillness that McGonagall produced in moments of genuine shock was different from the controlled composure she wore normally. It was thinner, a careful, rigid stillness that was using more effort than the casual observer would notice. Harry noticed it. He noticed it and let it be, didn't push, didn't speak. He had learned, from watching people absorb difficult truths, that the instinct to fill the silence was almost always wrong. She read the page. She picked it up, which he hadn't expected, and read it again. She set it down. The Guardian Authority Instrument, she said. Dated the 1st of November, 1981. No Wiesengemot countersignature. No other authorizing party. Harry kept his voice even. He signed it himself. That's, she stopped. Illegal, Hermione said, gently but without apology. Under wizarding law, the guardianship of an ancient and noble house heir requires full Wiesengemot decree. There is no provision for unilateral self-appointment. McGonagall set the page down very precisely, as if the placement of it mattered. She looked at Harry and he saw it, the thing he'd been watching for, the thing that made this particular conversation the most important one he would have before going to Dumbledore. He saw her not defending it. He had half expected her to. He'd prepared for it, the Dumbledore she had known, the things he'd accomplished, the decades of trust, the shared history. He'd expected some measure of the instinct to explain it, contextualize it, build a scaffold of justification around it. The way people did when someone they'd loved was found to have done something they couldn't reconcile. She didn't. 4,000,000 galleons, she said. Closer to 7, once estate income and interest are included. Her jaw tightened once. One precise movement. And the artifacts. 47 items. Some in wizarding museums, donated in his name. Some we can't trace yet. He paused. Some are here, Professor. In the castle. The room was very quiet. A portrait shifted. The lamp made no sound. The restricted section, McGonagall said. A Potter family grimoire, removed from the vault in 1979, 2 years before my parents died, and donated to the library under Dumbledore's name. Misfiled. Harry held her gaze. I have the legal standing to request its return. 8 active lordship claims, at least 4 of which predate Hogwarts' founding charter. Under the Treaty of 974, I can petition for the recovery of treaty-protected hereditary property. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, not just the intellectual assessment of the legal situation, but something more personal, more worn. The expression of a woman calculating the distance between where she had been and where she was now, and finding it further than she'd known. There's more in the headmaster's private quarters, she said quietly. Isn't there? Harry had not expected her to say it first. He kept that off his face. Item 31 on the artifacts list. An enchanted mirror, Black Potter provenance. I found it when I took the office, she said. I didn't know what it was. I put it in the storage room off the private quarters because it felt wrong to move it to the castle proper without knowing its history. She paused. I should have investigated further. You had no reason to, Harry said. You didn't know there was anything to investigate. She looked at him sharply, as if checking whether that was a courtesy or a genuinely meant statement. He held her gaze and let her read what was there. It was genuinely meant. I want to be clear with you, Harry said, before we go any further. I'm not here to do this quietly. I'm not going to manage this privately and let it disappear. What the audit found is going into the Wiesengemot, formally, with full documentation. He paused. But before it goes anywhere public, I need to speak to Dumbledore. And I wanted to speak to you first. Because I think you deserve to know what's coming before it arrives. McGonagall sat with that. Outside the windows, the rain had picked up again, running in thin channels down the old glass. The castle felt very large and very old around them. He'll be in his portrait, she said finally. He tends to return in the evenings. I know he was absent when we came in. Her chin lifted slightly. He knows the wards respond differently when you're here. He's known for 2 days. I felt the change in the ward resonance the day after you went to Gringotts, though I didn't understand it at the time. She paused. He'll have been watching his portrait frame. Good, Harry said. Then this conversation is already started. He stood. Hermione, Ron, and Neville rose with him. The restricted section first, Harry said to McGonagall. And then the private quarters for the mirror. And then, he looked at the empty portrait frame on the wall. Then I think the portrait and I need to have a conversation. McGonagall stood. She straightened her robes in the way she did when she was bracing herself, a small, private gesture Harry had catalogued over 7 years. She picked up the ledger copy from her desk and held it, not returning it. May I keep this? She asked. I brought it for you, he said. The restricted section at 9 in the evening was a particular kind of dark, deep and layered, the darkness of books that had been sitting in the same place for centuries and had come to an understanding with the shadows. Madame Pants had retired for the evening. McGonagall led them through the library with her wand lit, past the ordinary shelves and through the chain-linked gate, into the tight aisles of the restricted section where the books shifted uneasily at their presence and the air smelled of old magic and must. The Dumbledore donation catalogue was in the back corner, a section of shelves that bore a small brass plate reading donated by the Albus Dumbledore Collection, 1979 to 2003. Harry looked at the plate for a long moment before looking away. It should be there, Hermione said, running her finger along the spines without touching them. Misfiled means it was shelved under Dumbledore's name rather than its own provenance. Which is, actually an interesting decision, because if it was correctly catalogued under Potter provenance, anyone researching the family would have found it. Or someone researching it would have known where it was, Ron said. Misfiling it makes it invisible unless you know to look for it here specifically, Hermione agreed. She stopped at a thick, dark-bound volume with no title on the spine. She looked at Harry. He stepped forward and touched the spine with 2 fingers. The book moved. Not falling forward, moving toward him, actively, the way a dog turns toward its owner's hand. It cleared the shelf and settled into Harry's hands with a weight that was both physical and something else, a resonance, the same deep recognition he'd felt from the rings, but older. More intimate. This book knew his blood the way the rings had known it, but with the specific knowledge of something that had been made by his family's hands, held by his family's hands, written in by generations of people who shared his blood. He opened it. The first page bore 2 words in deep brown ink, Potter. Ours. He closed it again, gently, and held it against his chest. Hermione was watching him with an expression she'd mostly managed to keep off her face all day, genuine, personal grief on his behalf, the kind she usually kept contained because she knew he didn't want sympathy, he wanted action. But she let it show for a second, and he appreciated that she did. Let's get the mirror, he said. The storage room off the headmaster's private quarters was small and windowless, the kind of room that accumulated the residue of many successive headmasters, old trophies, broken instruments, things too significant to throw away and too inconvenient to display. McGonagall opened it and stepped back without entering, giving him the room, which was a thoughtful instinct. Harry stepped in. Neville came with him, and he was glad for it. There was something about the room that pressed at the edges of things, old magic left alone too long becoming faintly oppressive. The mirror was in the back, covered with a cloth. He didn't know why that detail bothered him more than some of the others, but it did. Someone had covered it, deliberately, as if it was something to be kept from seeing the room rather than the other way around. He pulled the cloth off. It was smaller than he'd imagined. About 2 feet high, in a frame that was either silver or very old white gold, with no inscription and no decoration on the frame at all, completely plain, completely at odds with the way the enchanted mirrors Harry had encountered tended to announce themselves. It reflected the room back at him, ordinary enough, except there was a second image behind his reflection. Not him. Not the room. A brief impression of a woman with red hair and a man with dark hair, standing close together, and then it was gone, the mirror showing only Harry's face looking back at him. His chest did something complicated. He picked it up carefully. That's bloodline magic, Neville said quietly beside him. I've read about them. They were used as family communication objects, but they had a secondary function. They would show the viewer their nearest magical blood ancestors under specific conditions. He paused. What conditions? I couldn't tell you offhand. I'll find out, Harry said. He wrapped the mirror in the cloth again, not because he wanted to cover it but because it needed protecting in transit. He tucked it under his arm along with the grimoire. He walked back to the headmaster's office. Dumbledore's portrait had returned. Harry noticed it the moment he came through the door, the painted figure back in his painted chair, the familiar half-moon glasses, the long silver beard, the expression of a man who has been waiting and is determined not to look like it. The eyes in the portrait were the familiar blue. Watchful. Warm, in the way that warmth can be a very practiced thing. Harry set the grimoire and the wrapped mirror on McGonagall's desk. He looked at the portrait. Dumbledore looked back. Hermione, Ron, and Neville had arranged themselves behind Harry with the instinctive spatial awareness of people who had spent years fighting beside each other. McGonagall stood to the side, not behind Harry, not behind Dumbledore's portrait, but to the side. Her own position, her own statement. Harry, the portrait said. The voice was almost right, the depth and the gentle authority of it, but portraits were never entirely right, everyone who had dealt with them knew that. They held the subject's knowledge, their habits, their self-image. They were not quite the person. Albus, Harry said. He hadn't decided in advance to use the first name. It arrived naturally, and it was, he thought, correct. They were past the careful proprieties. A pause. The painted eyes moved over Harry's right hand, over the rings, over the grimoire on the desk. You've been to Gringotts, Dumbledore's portrait said. You knew about the succession audit. I was aware it would be triggered by Goldtusk's passing, yes. I had been expecting it for some time. The portrait's expression was exactly what Harry had anticipated, composed, slightly sad, carrying the weight of someone who has made choices they considered necessary and has been waiting for the consequences. I imagine what they found was quite significant. 22 lordships, Harry said. 6,800,000 galleons in redirected funds and interest. 47 artifacts. He paused. And an unauthorized guardianship instrument dated November 1, 1981, signed only by you. The portrait was quiet. A grimoire removed from my family's vault in 1979, Harry continued. Under no valid authority, 2 years before my parents died. Before the guardian authority instrument even existed. He held Dumbledore's painted gaze. I want to understand that one specifically. Something moved through the portrait's expression, something that in a living person Harry would have identified as the decision to be honest, the kind of honesty that doesn't come easily because it requires abandoning the version of events you've been maintaining. Painted figures couldn't truly decide anything, but they reflected the self-image of their subjects with eerie accuracy, and Dumbledore's self-image had always included, Harry had learned tonight, the capacity for a certain kind of honest reckoning with his own choices. The grimoire, the portrait said, contained records of your family's hereditary magic. Specifically, the nature of the protection your mother's bloodline carried, a sacrificial enchantment chain that ran through the Evans maternal line going back 4 generations. A pause. I needed to understand the mechanism before I could use it. Harry was still. Use it. Lily's sacrifice. The protection it created over you. The portrait's voice was careful, measured, the tone of a man explaining a theorem. I had to understand its parameters, Harry. Its limitations. Whether it would hold under direct magical assault, whether it could be replicated or channeled. The grimoire contained the magical lineage record that allowed me to understand that your mother's sacrifice wasn't an accident of love, it was the culmination of a 4-generation chain of hereditary magic that her blood had been building toward. You knew, Harry said, and his voice was still level, still clear, but carrying something now, the weight of everything being reconfigured at once. Before she died. You knew what her sacrifice would do. I knew what it might do, the portrait said carefully. The precise conditions were, you knew what it might do, Harry repeated. And you didn't tell her. The portrait was quiet. The painted fire in the painted hearth seemed to dim slightly, which was the portrait's ambient enchantments reflecting the emotional state it had been keyed to. Even in paint and magic, Dumbledore had never been able to entirely hide the things he actually felt. If I had told her, the portrait said, she might have chosen differently. She might have tried to survive. The protection required a fully willing, fully conscious sacrifice. If she'd known the mechanism, she would have made the same choice, Harry said. Flat. Certain. You knew her. You worked with her. You know she would have made the same choice. He stepped forward, closer to the portrait. You didn't tell her because you didn't trust the purity of her willingness if it was informed. You wanted her to make the choice in complete innocence so there was no variable. So it was clean. He paused. So your plan had no variable. The silence in the room was absolute. Neville, behind Harry, hadn't moved. Hermione had her hand pressed flat on her own forearm, the gesture she made when she was holding herself very still. Ron was looking at the portrait with an expression that Harry, without looking, could feel, the slow, furious grief of someone who has worshipped a person from a distance and is watching the distance collapse. McGonagall made a sound. Small, quiet, involuntary, the sound of someone who has been holding themselves rigid against something and has just been struck from a direction they weren't braced for. You planned it, she said. Not to Harry. To the portrait. You planned all of it. I did what was necessary to ensure, the portrait began. Don't, Harry said. Quiet. Completely final. Don't tell me what was necessary. I sat in this school for 7 years and I learned from you and I believed that everything you kept from me was kept out of care. That the management was difficult but it was care. He looked at the portrait. The vault. The gold. The grimoire. The 39 years of my inheritance going somewhere that wasn't mine. Was any of that necessary? Or was that just, taking? Because you could. The portrait looked at him. The familiar blue eyes. The weight of a very intelligent man who has built his entire self-image around the certainty that what he did was right, confronting something that does not accommodate that certainty. I intended, the portrait said carefully, to restore the principal holdings to you once the war was concluded and you were established. The funds were used primarily for the Order of the Phoenix, for operational costs, safe house maintenance, for the protection of people who, I want the accounting, Harry said. Every galleon of those 6,800,000, I want to know where it went. I want the Order's financial records from Gringotts. I want documentation. He paused. Because you're going to need it, when this goes to the Wizengamot. The portrait stilled completely. You intend to bring this to the Wizengamot? Of course I do. Harry. The portrait's voice shifted, not to pleading, because Dumbledore's self-image did not accommodate pleading, but to something more intimate, more personal. What I did, the choices I made, they were in service of something larger than, I know, Harry said. I believe you believe that. I believed it for a long time myself. He stepped back. He picked up the grimoire from the desk and held it. The Wizengamot needs to decide what it means. Not me. Not you. Not a private conversation in this office. He looked at the portrait one last time. I'm not angry at you for the war, he said. I understand the war. I understand necessity and sacrifice and terrible choices made in the dark. I grew up in that. I fought in that. A pause. I'm angry at you for the 39 years. For the grimoire in 1979. For my mother. For all the things you decided I didn't need to know because knowledge was a variable you couldn't control. He turned away from the portrait. Professor McGonagall, he said, I'll need a formal inventory of everything in the restricted section under the Dumbledore donation catalog. And everything in the castle that was listed in the Gringotts artifacts assessment. You'll have it by Monday, she said. Her voice was steady. Her face was the face of a woman who has paid a specific kind of price today and is deciding, with characteristic precision, what to do with it. Thank you. He looked at Neville, at Hermione, at Ron. We should go. They moved toward the door. Harry paused at the threshold and looked back, not at the portrait, but at the room itself. At the high windows and the spinning silver instruments and the moving portraits and the chair where Dumbledore had sat across from him so many times, patient and warm and always in possession of more than Harry knew. One more thing, he said, to the portrait, because there was one more thing and he wasn't going to leave without saying it. The letters. My mother's letters, removed from the vault on the 2nd of November, 1981. He looked at the painted figure directly. Where are they? The portrait was silent for a long moment. Long enough that Harry had begun to turn away again. Desk, the portrait said. Quietly. Bottom drawer. They have been there since I moved into this office. Harry walked back to the desk. McGonagall stepped aside. He opened the bottom drawer. At the back of it, behind a bundle of old quills and a broken sneakoscope, there was a sealed packet of letters bound with a faded green ribbon. His mother's handwriting on the outside, for James, the ink still clear, the paper slightly yellowed. He picked them up. He held them the way he'd held the grimoire, carefully, with both hands, with the awareness of something irreplaceable. He looked at the portrait one more time. The painted eyes looked back at him, still carrying that warmth, that weight of love and conviction and the absolute certainty of a man who had spent his life believing that the ends he served were large enough to justify whatever they cost. I hope, Harry said, that it was worth it. To you. Because you need to be able to answer that question, when they ask. He put the letters in his jacket, against his chest, and walked out of the office. The castle was very quiet around them as they descended the moving staircases, the only sounds the distant creak of old stone and the rain against the high windows. Nobody spoke. The words in that room needed space to settle. They walked out through the great oak doors into the cold night air, and the gates at the bottom of the grounds opened again as they approached, the same smooth, authoritative swing, the castle acknowledging what it had acknowledged before, and Harry walked through them into the dark with a grimoire under one arm and his mother's letters over his heart and 22 claims burning warm on his hand, and behind him the castle stood in the rain looking exactly as it always had, ancient and illuminated and full of things that had been sitting in the dark for a very long time. Waiting for someone to finally come and get them. Chapter 4, The Floor of the Wizengamot. The summons went out on a Wednesday. Harry wrote it himself, not the legal language, which Hermione drafted in 3 hours on Sunday morning with the Treaty of 974 open on one side of her desk and Wizengamot procedural law, ancient and modern practice open on the other, but the covering letter, the one that would go to every sitting member personally, above the formal petition. Short. Plain. His name at the bottom and his lordship designations beneath it, all 22, which filled 4 lines. He'd activated 6 more rings over the weekend. The process was getting smoother, less like forcing stiff hinges and more like walking through doors he'd simply never known were there. Neville had been present for several of them, working through the MacBoon documentation with Sharp Fong in parallel, and by Sunday evening Neville had 2 active Scottish lordship claims of his own and the quiet, settled look of a man who has found something he didn't know he'd lost. Augusta Longbottom, upon being told, had sat very still at her kitchen table for approximately 45 seconds and then said, with tremendous composure, I knew it. I have been saying for 30 years that those claims were real. She'd then produced, from a drawer that apparently held such things ready, a family record document that she'd been maintaining herself, cross-referenced with every relevant treaty citation she'd been able to find. She slid it across the table to Neville without a word. Neville had looked at his grandmother for a long moment and then said, You could have told me. You never asked, she said, which was both entirely unfair and, knowing Augusta Longbottom, completely characteristic. Harry had left them to it. The formal petition invoked three separate legal instruments: the Treaty of 974, Article 12, the Wizarding Inheritance Act of 1692, which governed the handling of ancient and noble house estates, and the Goblin Wizard Accord of 1865, under which vault theft, specifically the unauthorized redirection of vault holdings, was a prosecutable offense that carried mandatory Wisengamot review. Hermione had found the 1865 Accord at midnight on Saturday and come into the kitchen where Harry was making tea with the expression of someone who has located exactly the right weapon. "They can't table it," she'd said. "Under the Accord, mandatory review means mandatory. No delays, no committee referrals, no quiet burial in procedural subcommittee. Once the petition is filed with Gringotts documentation attached, the Wisengamot has to convene within 10 days. Harry had poured her a cup of tea. "Good. Dumbledore has allies on the Wisengamot. Elphia's Doge. Griselda Marchbanks. Several others who voted with him for decades. I know. They'll push back. Let them." She'd looked at him over her tea. "You're not nervous." "I'm not nervous," he'd agreed. "Most people would be at least a little nervous about addressing the full Wisengamot. I've faced Voldemort 7 times, Hermione. The Wisengamot is just people in funny hats." She'd almost smiled. "They're very significant funny hats." Noted. The petition was filed at Gringotts on Monday morning, with Ragnok's full documentation attached, countersigned by Ragnok himself as the Goblin representative under the 1865 Accord. The Wisengamot's clerk sent confirmation by return owl within 2 hours. The session was scheduled for Thursday at 10 in the morning. 3 days. Kingsley Shacklebolt found Harry on Wednesday afternoon. Harry was in the garden behind Grimmauld Place, which he'd been slowly making habitable over the past year, clearing the worst of the Black family's more hostile plantings and replacing them with things that didn't attempt to bite, and was sitting on the back step reading the Potter grimoire in the thin autumn sunlight when the Floo from inside called his name. Kingsley ducked through the back door with his ministerial robes open, his expression carrying the particular professional composure of a man who has been in high-stakes politics long enough that nothing shows on his face unless he decides to show it. He looked at Harry. He looked at the grimoire. He sat down on the step beside Harry without being invited, because that was the particular prerogative of men who had known you since you were 17 and had fought a war alongside you. "The petition arrived on my desk this morning," Kingsley said. "The Ministry isn't a party to the Accord proceedings," Harry said. "Formally." "No. Formally." Kingsley looked at the garden. "Off the record, Harry." Harry closed the grimoire. "Off the record. How solid is it?" Gringotts verified vault ledgers. Treaty certified bloodline documentation. 47 catalogued artifacts, 11 of which are already recovered. A guardian authority instrument with no Wisengamot countersignature. Harry looked at him. "It's granite, Kingsley." Kingsley absorbed this with the stillness of a man who has already absorbed most of it from other sources and is confirming what he suspected. "He was my mentor," he said quietly. "The Order, everything I did in the war, everything I've done since, a lot of that is built on what he taught me." "I know. That doesn't change what the ledgers show." "No," Harry agreed. "It doesn't." They sat with that for a moment. A late butterfly made an unlikely appearance over the cleared flower bed, and Harry watched it without particularly registering it. "Will the Ministry stand in the way?" Harry asked. "No. Flat. Immediate. My personal feelings are not the Ministry's position. The Ministry's position is that the law applies to everyone. That's always been the position, in theory." A slight pause. "I'm going to make sure it's the position in practice tomorrow." Harry looked at him. "You're coming." "I'm the Minister for Magic." A Wisengamot session of this magnitude, filed under the Goblin Wizard Accord? Kingsley met his eyes. "I'll be in my seat." "Some of them are going to try to frame it as an attack on his legacy," Harry said. "On the war effort." They'll say the order needed funding, the gold went to a good cause, Dumbledore deserves the benefit of history's judgment. Probably, Kingsley said. What will you say? Harry thought about it. About the right answer versus the honest answer, and whether they were the same thing in this case. That his legacy is his to own, Harry said. Every part of it. The good and the rest. You don't get to keep the gold and donate the heroism. Kingsley was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, smoothing his robes. I'll see you tomorrow, he said. He paused at the back door. The lordship claims, all 22. You're going to use that standing tomorrow. Yes. Good, Kingsley said. Do it loudly. He went back inside. Harry opened the grimoire again, but he didn't read. He sat with the autumn light on the old pages and thought about tomorrow, and the shape of it, and what he was walking into. Not nervousness. Not dread. Something cleaner, the specific readiness of someone who has spent a week preparing for exactly this and knows, with the unhurried certainty of good preparation, that they are ready. The Wizengamot chamber was underneath the Ministry of Magic, 5 levels below the atrium, and had the specific quality of important underground rooms, still air, perfect acoustics, the kind of absolute quiet that only existed in places that had been sealed away from street noise and weather for centuries. The walls were dark stone, hung with tapestries that depicted significant moments in British magical history. The seating formed a horseshoe of tiered benches, filled with witches and wizards in plum-colored robes, and at the head of the horseshoe, the Wizengamot chief warlock seat, currently occupied by a witch named Griselda Marchbanks who was 93 years old, had examined Dumbledore's OWLS, and had voted with him on every significant resolution since 1971. Harry noted this. He arrived early, not nervously early, but strategically early, because he wanted to be in the room and settled before the gallery filled. He came in the public entrance with Hermione on one side, Neville on the other, and Ron behind them. He was wearing his best robes, dark navy, properly fitted, which Hermione had insisted on and Harry had not argued with because she was right. He had the Gringotts satchel. He had the rings, all 14 now active, the remaining 8 warm but dormant on his hand and at his belt in their cases. The public gallery was already half full. Several journalists. A number of faces he recognized, Order members, people who had worked alongside Dumbledore for decades, people who had never met Harry but had voted to strip him of his wand at 15. He sat at the petitioner's table, which was positioned in the open center of the horseshoe, facing the chief warlock seat. Neville sat beside him at the same table. The Longbottom lordship claims made him a secondary petitioner, a standing Sharp Fong had confirmed was valid. Hermione and Ron took seats in the front row of the gallery, directly behind the petitioner's table. Ragnok had sent 2 Goblin representatives, Sharp Fong and a senior legal officer named Brasshelm, who seated themselves to the side with the self-contained authority of people who are perfectly comfortable being the only members of their species in the room and do not require anyone to acknowledge this. The chamber filled. The plum robes, row on row. The quiet conversations and the careful avoidance of eye contact from certain quarters. Elphia's doge, near the back, who had been Dumbledore's friend since they were 11 years old, and whose face was pale with the effort of composure. Kingsley came in last, in his ministerial robes, and took his observer's seat at the far end of the horseshoe. He didn't look at Harry. He didn't need to. Marchbanks called the session to order. She was sharp, even at 93, Harry had expected her to be a problem and she was immediately proving him right with the efficient, authoritative manner in which she controlled the room's opening. She announced the petition formally, cited the relevant legal instruments, and looked at Harry over her half-moon glasses with an expression that was not quite hostile and not quite neutral, the expression of a woman who has already decided several things and is waiting to see if the evidence changes them. "Mr. Potter," she said. "You have filed this petition as a peer of the realm under the Treaty of 974, citing 22 active lordship claims. I will note for the record that the claims have been reviewed by this chamber's legal office and found to be facially valid under treaty law." A brief pause, carrying a world of reluctance. Please present your case. Harry stood. He didn't have notes in front of him. He had the satchel open on the table with the relevant documents available, but he didn't need to look at them. He'd spent a week with this material until it was part of him, until he could answer any question from any direction without having to find a page. He stood in the center of the horseshoe and looked at the room. I want to start with what this isn't, he said. This is not an argument about Albus Dumbledore's place in the history of the magical world. It is not about his accomplishments, his service, or his sacrifices. I am not standing here to relitigate the war or to suggest that the Order of the Phoenix didn't matter. He paused. This is about vault law. Inheritance law. The Treaty of 974, which this chamber is bound to uphold. And documented, Gringotts verified evidence of what was done with my family's holdings over a 39-year period. He looked at Marchbanks. That's what I'm asking this chamber to adjudicate. Not a legacy. A law. He sat down and nodded to Hermione, who passed forward the first set of documents, copies of the Gringotts ledger summary, prepared in sufficient number for every sitting member. They moved through the chamber's clerks with the quiet efficiency of well-prepared legal proceedings. He let them read. The room's silence changed quality as they read. It went from the controlled quiet of a formal proceeding to the different quiet of people absorbing something that is rearranging their understanding. He watched it move around the horseshoe, the slight shifts in posture, the controlled expressions working harder than they had been a minute ago. Elphia's Doge spoke first, which Harry had expected. Chief Warlock, Doge said, rising, his voice tight with emotion he was not entirely containing. These documents, he stopped. Regrouped. Albus Dumbledore dedicated his life to the safety of this world. Whatever administrative irregularities may appear in these records, administrative irregularities, Harry said. Doge turned to look at him. I want to be precise, Harry said, pleasantly. The Gringotts verified ledger shows 4,200,000 galleons in unauthorized withdrawals from the Potter vaults over 39 years, under a guardianship instrument that carries no Wisengamot countersignature, no ministry authorization, and no family consent. Under the Goblin Wizard Accord of 1865, that is not an administrative irregularity. That is vault theft. He looked at Marchbanks. I'd like the precise legal term entered into the record, if the chamber is willing. Marchbanks studied him. The chamber will note the distinction, she said, with the quality of a woman choosing her battles intelligently. I'd also like to enter, Harry continued, the evidence of vault access in 1979, 2 years before the Guardian instrument even existed. Item 23, the Potter family grimoire. He held it up briefly, the physical original, recovered from Hogwarts, before setting it on the table. Removed without any instrument of authority. Which Gringotts is currently investigating as a separate matter of unauthorized vault access. He looked at Sharp Fong, who nodded once in confirmation. A murmur ran around the chamber. Not loud, this was the Wisengamot, not a pub, but present, the specific murmur of people recalibrating. A witch in the middle tier raised her hand. She was probably 60, with a face Harry didn't recognize but a manner that suggested she'd been in these seats for a while. Lord Potter, she said, the lordship address, and Harry noticed several people register it, the weight of 22 claims behind 2 words. The petition cites total recoverable holdings of 6,800,000 galleons, including diverted estate income and interest. Is Gringotts prepared to stand behind that figure? Brasshelm stood from the Goblin representatives' table. He was shorter than everyone in the room except by Goblin standards appeared to take up the same amount of space as a much taller man. Gringotts stands behind every figure in this documentation, he said, in precise, unaccented English that carried the weight of an institution speaking. The vault ledger is a magically verified record. It cannot be falsified. Every number in the petition summary has been independently verified by 3 separate Goblin audit teams. He paused. Additionally, Gringotts acknowledges its own institutional failure in permitting withdrawals under the instrument provided, and commits to full cooperation with any legal proceedings arising from this matter. The chamber murmured again. A Goblin institution voluntarily acknowledging institutional failure in open Gringotts session was not something that happened regularly, and the room knew it. Another member, older, male, someone who had Dumbledore's political alignments stamped all over his voting history, stood without being recognized. "This is a posthumous proceeding," he said flatly. "Albus Dumbledore cannot be present to." "He is present," Harry said. A silence. "His portrait at Hogwarts retains his full knowledge and can speak to his reasoning," Harry said. "I have been informed by magical law precedent, which Miss Granger will cite if the chamber requires it, that Hogwarts headmaster portraits carry the same evidential standing as a magical oath in Gringotts proceedings. They cannot knowingly misrepresent facts." He looked at the man who had spoken. "I have already spoken to the portrait." He acknowledged the guardianship instrument, acknowledged the vault withdrawals, and stated that the funds were used for Order of the Phoenix operations. "I'm asking the chamber to require a full accounting of those operational funds, receipts, expenditure records, surviving Order members who can confirm or deny the claims." The man sat down. This was the pivot of it. Harry had felt it coming for the last 5 minutes, the moment when the chamber would have to choose between defending the idea of Dumbledore and engaging with the evidence. He watched it happen in real time, watched the sitting members who had been preparing defensive arguments slowly adjust as they registered that the arguments they'd prepared were not going to connect with the material in front of them. Marchbanks cleared her throat. "I will note," she said, and her voice had shifted, still controlled, still authoritative, but carrying something different now, the quality of a woman who has assessed the room and made a decision about which side of this she is going to stand on. "I will note that the chamber cannot ignore documented vault violations regardless of the identity of the party responsible. That is the foundational principle of this institution." A pause. "The question before us is not whether Albus Dumbledore was a great man. He was. The question before us is whether great men are subject to the law." Another pause. "They are." The chamber was very quiet. Harry let it be quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like to present the artifacts documentation." He walked through it methodically, not every item, but the significant ones. The grimoire. The enchanted mirror. The sealed letters. He was factual, clean, no performance of emotion. He didn't need to perform anything, the material performed itself. When he got to item 38, his mother's letters, removed from the vault the day after she died, he stated it plainly and moved on, and the room's quiet took on a different texture that he recognized as the specific silence of collective discomfort. "Good," he thought. "Sit with that." When he finished, he sat down. Neville stood. Neville's portion was shorter, he was not the primary petitioner, but it mattered, and Harry had known it would matter when he'd suggested to Neville that he present the MacBoon Lordship documentation himself rather than letting Hermione handle it as a supplementary exhibit. Because Neville standing up in the Gringotts chamber and invoking ancient Scottish treaty rights with the steady, unhurried confidence of someone who had fought in a war and grown a spine made of something more than bone, that was a different message than the same information presented by counsel. Several members who had not been giving the MacBoon documentation much attention began giving it considerably more attention when it was Neville Longbottom presenting it. Augusta Longbottom was in the gallery. Harry had spotted her when he came in, 4th row, best robes, straight back, expression of absolute controlled composure that was doing a great deal of work. When Neville sat down she was looking at her grandson with something that, given how well Harry knew her face, was the closest it came to open, unguarded pride. The chamber broke for 30 minutes. Harry stood in the corridor outside the chamber with a cup of bad ministry tea and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill he'd been developing and was finding increasingly useful. Kingsley appeared beside him. Not dramatically, just walked up the corridor and stood there, which was also a skill. "Marchbanks," Harry said quietly. "Changed her mind in the first 10 minutes, Kingsley said. "You could see it. The 1979 access. That was the one that moved her." "The 1979 access moved everyone," Kingsley said. "Before the Guardian instrument. Before any legal cover at all. That turned it from a complicated question about wartime necessity into something much simpler. Harry drank his bad tea. They're going to vote for a formal inquiry. Full accounting of order funds, recovery order for outstanding artifacts, and a formal censure. Probably. The censure will be symbolic, you know that. He's dead. I know. Is that enough for you? Harry thought about it honestly. The censure is for the record, he said. For history. So there's a document that says the truth plainly. He looked at his cup. What matters to me is the artifact's recovery, the full accounting, and, he paused. The Wisengamot acknowledging that the lordship claims are valid and active. That's the part that has weight going forward. Kingsley looked at him. Going forward. I'm not retiring to the country, Harry said. 22 lordship claims in 3 countries. Seats in the Wisengamot. Holdings and estate obligations and treaty responsibilities. He paused. I need to understand what all of it means. What I'm supposed to do with it. What do you think you're supposed to do with it? Harry finished the tea. Something that isn't what it's been used for the last 39 years, he said simply, and went back inside. The vote took 40 minutes. The inquiry motion passed with 61 votes to 12. The 12 who voted against were a mixture of genuine Dumbledore loyalists and 2 members who, Harry thought, were voting defensively for reasons that would probably become apparent during the inquiry itself. The artifact recovery order passed unanimously, which surprised him slightly. The formal censure passed 58 to 15, the larger dissent, because that was the one that stung symbolically, the one that would be in the history books. Harry understood the 15. He didn't agree with them, but he understood the grief behind their votes. And then Marchbanks raised the final motion, the validation and formal recognition of Harry's lordship claims under the Treaty of 974, which would have legal force across the British magical world and the international treaty signatories. This motion, Marchbanks said, and her voice had taken on the quality of a woman doing something she has decided to do properly, is not a reward and is not a political statement. It is the correction of a legal record that should have been corrected when the heir reached majority. The claims are documented, Goblin verified, and treaty valid. I will read them for the record. She read all 22. In the still air of the chamber, each name landed with weight, some of them familiar, some of them names that hadn't been spoken in Wisengamot proceedings for generations. The Potter Peveril claim. The Fleamont Cavendish. The Black Allied claims through Sirius's bequest. The French lordships, the Scottish ones, the German holding, the Irish lines. When she finished, the chamber was the specific quiet of people hearing history being made and knowing it. All in favor, Marchbanks said. 73-0. The unanimity surprised everyone, including, Harry thought, some of the members who cast it. But it was there, and once it was there, it was permanent and public and part of the record, which was exactly what it needed to be. Harry sat with the vote for a moment. He didn't stand up, didn't acknowledge the gallery, didn't do anything dramatic. He sat and let the numbers settle. Neville, beside him, was perfectly still in the way of someone registering something that will take time to fully arrive at. Then Harry leaned over and said quietly, in Neville's ear, "How's your gran looking?" Neville glanced back at the gallery. A pause. "Like she's trying very hard not to cry," he said. "Which means she's crying." Harry smiled. Small, genuine, the first real smile of the day. "Good." He began gathering the satchel. A voice reached him from the gallery, not calling out, not dramatic, just a voice he recognized that he hadn't expected to hear. He looked up. Minerva McGonagall was in the gallery, 4th row opposite from Augusta, in her teaching robes with her grey hair pinned back and her expression doing the careful, controlled thing it did when it was actually doing several things at once. She hadn't been there when the session started. She had come for the vote. Their eyes met across the chamber. He held her gaze. She gave him a single, precise nod, the kind of nod that meant something, that carried the full weight of a woman who had spent 40 years loving a complicated man and had come here today to stand on the right side of the truth about him. Harry nodded back. He closed the satchel, stood, and walked out of the Wisengamot chamber with the sessions vote still settling in the still underground air behind him, the rings warm on his hand, the grimoire in his bag alongside his mother's letters, and in front of him a corridor that led back up to a world that had just shifted, quietly but permanently, in a direction that nobody, not Dumbledore's allies, not the history books, not the careful 39-year architecture of someone else's plan, was going to be able to shift back. He walked up into the ministry atrium, into the noise and the ordinary movement of a Thursday morning, and took a breath of recycled ministry air that smelled of paper and magic and the particular institutional smell of a place that had just been reminded, in a chamber 5 floors below, that the law was not, in the end, optional for anyone. Even great men. Especially great men. Chapter 5, The Depths the Mirror Spoke on a Sunday. Harry had been sitting with it for 3 days, not obsessively, not in the way he'd sat with the mirror of Eriste at 11, crouched on the cold floor of that empty classroom, unable to leave. This was different. He'd set it on the desk in the grim old place study, angled where the morning light could reach it, and he'd been reading the grimoire beside it for an hour each day, letting himself get used to the presence of it before he expected anything from it. The grimoire had already given him a great deal. It was not a spellbook in any conventional sense. It was a family record, 400 years of Potter magical history written in 7 different hands, each generation adding to the one before, a continuous conversation across time. Birth records, death records, the documentation of hereditary gifts and how they expressed in each child, alliances made and broken, the careful mapping of bloodline magic as it evolved and strengthened and occasionally, noted with clinical honesty by whoever was writing, diminished. He'd found his grandfather's entry, Fleamont, neat cramped handwriting, a brief and funny self-assessment of his own magical abilities followed by a longer, more careful note about his wife Euphemia. He'd found his father's entry in James's own young handwriting, dramatic, confident, slightly showing off, and then a second entry years later in the same hand but different, quieter, written when James was 22 and had just married Lily and was clearly trying to do the record justice. Lily Jeanette Evans Potter. Her magic is not like ours, it is cleaner, somehow, like water where ours is stone. I don't know how to write it adequately, so I'll just say, it is extraordinary, and so is she, and our children will be something else entirely. Harry had read that twice. Then he'd closed the grimoire, walked to the kitchen, and stood at the window for 10 minutes. Then he'd gone back and kept reading. The entry about the Evans bloodline was what Dumbledore had come looking for in 1979. Harry found it in the 3rd section of the grimoire, written by Fleamont, not about Lily specifically but about the magical lineage she carried, which Fleamont had apparently researched extensively after James brought her home for the first time. The Evans line, Fleamont had written, carried a hereditary magic that he called sacrificial resonance, a layered enchantment that built through generations of witches in the line who had each, in some significant moment, placed another person's life above their own at magical cost. Not death, necessarily. But genuine, willing sacrifice of something real. Each act strengthened the next generation's capacity. By Lily's generation, the resonance had accumulated for 4 generations. If she ever completed the chain, if she made the full sacrificial choice, the one that cost everything, the protection it would generate would be of a magnitude the magical world had not seen since the founders. Fleamont had written it as a theoretical observation. He had no idea his daughter-in-law would become the proof. Dumbledore had read this entry in 1979. 2 years later, Voldemort had marked Harry as his equal from a prophecy, and Dumbledore had known, with the grimoire's evidence in hand, exactly what Lily Potter's death could do if the conditions were right. Harry sat with this knowledge for a long time before deciding what it meant. It meant Dumbledore hadn't simply had a plan. He'd had the blueprint for the plan 2 years before he implemented it. He'd read the grimoire and understood the mechanism and then spent 2 years watching events develop, and when the pieces aligned, when Voldemort chose Harry, when the Potters needed to go into hiding, he had made choices that positioned the sacrifice correctly. Not caused it. Harry was clear-eyed about that. He wasn't suggesting Dumbledore had wanted his parents to die. He was suggesting something more precise, that Dumbledore had known what their deaths could mean, and he had arranged things to ensure that if the worst happened, the worst would also be the best possible outcome for the war. He had used them. With love, with grief, with absolute conviction that it was necessary, but used them nonetheless. The mirror spoke on the Sunday after that realization had fully settled. Harry was sitting with his morning tea and the grimoire when the reflection shifted, not to his parents, as it had done briefly in the Hogwarts storage room, but to someone else. A woman he didn't recognize at first, middle-aged, with his father's dark hair and his grandmother Euphemia's nose, sitting at a desk that looked like a version of this very room, or a version of it from 60 years ago. She looked directly at him. "Oh," she said. "There you are." Harry set his tea down. "Who are you?" "Your great-aunt Doria Potter, née Black," she said pleasantly, as if this were a perfectly normal Sunday conversation. "I enchanted this mirror in 1958. It was meant for family communication, specifically for the heir to find when they were ready. I didn't expect it to take quite this long." She looked him over with bright, sharp eyes. "You have James's hair, which is a shame for everyone involved, but Lily's eyes, which somewhat compensates." Harry had so many questions simultaneously that he defaulted to the most practical one. "How does this work? Are you a portrait?" "Not exactly. I embedded a magical impression of myself into the mirror's enchantment, not a full portrait, which requires quite an elaborate process and a significant amount of depth as a prerequisite." She said this conversationally. "Think of me as a letter that can have a conversation. I know what I knew when I created this impression, I can engage with whatever you show or tell me, but I'm not Doria Black. I'm what Doria Black chose to leave behind." She paused. She was always practical that way. She referred to herself in the third person. Only about herself in the past tense. It seemed tidier. Harry almost smiled. The mirror was in Dumbledore's possession for 40 years. Doria's expression did something sharp and precise. Was it? I had wondered why I hadn't been activated. The mirror responds to Potter blood within proximity. If it spent 40 years in a place where you never went, or where Dumbledore kept it specifically away from you, he had it at Hogwarts. I was there for 7 years. Then he kept it somewhere you would not encounter it, Doria said, with the specific tone of someone filing information in a category marked exactly as suspected. The Blacks and the Potters were allied families for several generations. I had access to a great deal of family knowledge before I died. Some of which, she paused, I suspect is relevant to whatever you've been reading in that grimoire. Harry looked at the book in his hands. The Evans bloodline. Sacrificial resonance. Yes. Her expression shifted into something more careful. But that's not the whole of it, is it? If you've read that section, you've found the theory. What I can tell you, what Fleamont never had access to, is the practical history. She leaned forward slightly, which was a strange effect in a mirror. Your grandmother Euphemia. She was the third generation in the chain. The sacrificial resonance chain. Euphemia made her sacrifice when James was 3 years old. A Death Eater attack on the Potter estate, this house, actually, a different wing. She threw herself in front of a killing curse aimed at James and survived because Fleamont managed a shield in time, but the intent was fully realized. She was willing. She believed she was going to die. The magic registered it. Doria's eyes were intent. By the time Lily came along, 4th generation, the accumulated resonance was already remarkable. And Lily's own magic was, well. Lily Evans was something exceptional even before she understood what she was carrying. Harry was very still. Dumbledore knew all of this, he said. He knew what the grimoire told him in 1979. Which was the theory and the lineage record and Fleamont's careful documentation of the Evans bloodline. She paused. What he may not have known, because it wasn't in the grimoire, it was in my mirror, which he apparently kept without ever activating, was the mechanism's secondary effect. Harry looked at her. Secondary effect. Doria was quiet for a moment. The mirror's surface shifted slightly around her, a ripple of old magic. Sacrificial resonance of the fourth generation magnitude, she said carefully, doesn't simply create a protection over the intended recipient. It creates a mark. A permanent embedding of the sacrificer's magic into the recipient's own magical core. She let that sit for a moment. Your magical core, Harry. Lily's sacrifice didn't just protect you. It became part of you. Permanently. The Evans line's sacrificial resonance is in you, woven into your magic as foundational structure. Harry set the grimoire down. He looked at his hand. At the rings. At the warm weight of 14 active claims. That's why the Horcrux didn't destroy me, he said. Not asking. The pieces connecting themselves in the quiet of the Sunday morning study with the precision of things that have been waiting to connect. The shard of Voldemort's soul in me, it should have been fatal when he killed me in the forest. But Lily's magic was structural to my core. He couldn't destroy the soul fragment without going through the sacrificial resonance first. And the resonance, turned it back, Doria said quietly. As it was always designed to do. The fourth generation resonance is not passive protection. It is active return. Whatever harm comes to the bearer is returned to its source. She paused. You were never just a boy who survived a killing curse, Harry. You were the final completion of a 4-generation magical working that had been building for 60 years. The magic that saved you in the forest was your mother's and your grandmother's and 2 generations of women before them, all arriving at once. The study was very quiet. Harry became aware that his face was doing something he hadn't entirely authorized it to do. He put the grimoire on the desk and pressed his hands flat on the surface and breathed once, deliberately. Dumbledore didn't know this part, he said. He couldn't have. It wasn't documented anywhere that he had access to. Doria's voice was steady, precise, but with something underneath it that the magical impression of a dead woman carried faithfully, genuine grief for the family she'd loved. He knew the theory. He worked with incomplete information. That does not excuse what he chose to do with that information, but, no, Harry said. It doesn't. He picked the grimoire back up. He turned to the section on the Evans bloodline and reread Fleamont's entry, this time with the mirror's information alongside it, and spent 20 minutes sitting with the complete picture. Then he looked up at Doria. Is there anything else in the mirror? Other information she kept? The full Peveril inheritance documentation, Doria said. Which is considerably more significant than the standard account suggests. The Black family maintained records of the Peveril line that the Potters didn't have direct access to. Doria kept copies. A brief pause. And a letter. Written by Doria herself, addressed to the heir of the Potter line, which I am instructed to deliver when the heir has claimed at least 8 active lordships. Harry held up his right hand wordlessly. The mirror's surface shimmered. A folded piece of parchment appeared at the bottom of the frame and slid forward as if gravity operated differently for it, landing on the desk in front of Harry with the distinct quality of something that had been waiting precisely as long as it was supposed to wait. He unfolded it. To whoever you are when you read this, the Peveril line does not end with an object. People have always made that mistake, they focus on the hallows, the instruments, the things that can be held and used and sought after. The hallows are real but they are not the inheritance. The inheritance is what the hallows represent, which is the 3 aspects of mastery that the Peveril line was bred to carry: mastery over death, the cloak, mastery over power, the wand, and mastery of self, the stone, which was never about resurrection, that was a story told to people who weren't ready for the truth. The stone is a mirror. It shows you what is real. Not what you want. Not the dead. What is real about yourself, your actual nature, the full account of what you are. Dumbledore sought the Hallows because he wanted to master death. He was wrong about what they offered. He spent his life wrong about it. The cloak was never his to keep. If you have it, and I believe you do, it was always yours, and always will be. The wand chose you at the end because you had mastered power without becoming its servant. The stone, if you have looked into it and seen something true about yourself rather than something you wanted, you have already done what it was made for. You are the last Peveril heir in the direct line. The magic is not in the objects. It never was. It is in you. Be something worth inheriting. Doria Potter, née Black, 1958. Harry read it twice. The handwriting was different from the grimoire, sharper, more angular, the pen of a woman who wrote quickly and meant every word. He folded it carefully and set it beside the grimoire. He looked at Doria's reflection in the mirror. She knew, he said. Even in 1958, she knew about the Hallows. The Blacks have always known about the Hallows, Doria said simply. We are the descendants of Cadmus Peveril. The stone was ours. We simply chose not to advertise it, because the Blacks, for all their many considerable faults, understood the difference between having something powerful and broadcasting it. Harry thought about that. Then he thought about the specific item in the Gringotts artifacts list that he hadn't yet spoken aloud to anyone except in the context of the 47 items collectively. Item 43, 1. Black family object, purpose and nature unknown, removed from Potter Vault April 16, 1992. Current location, Hogwarts Castle. 1992, his first year. The specific week after he'd encountered the Mirror of Erist. He'd been thinking about it for days. A black family object, removed when Dumbledore had realized, perhaps from Harry's behavior after finding the mirror, perhaps from other evidence, that Harry had already stumbled into the vicinity of something significant. The stone, Harry said. The resurrection stone. Was it in my vault? Doria's expression was extraordinary. Not surprise, something deeper, the reaction of a magical impression meeting a truth it had been structured to respond to. It has been in the Potter Vault since 1899, she said. Kept there by Antioch Peveril's last legitimate descendant, who passed it to the Potter line through a blood adoption that, she stopped. It was in the ring. Harry looked at the Peveril ring on his hand. Dark stone, oval, the Deathly Hallows symbol engraved. He had been wearing the resurrection stone for 2 weeks and had not known it. He stood up so fast the chair scraped back. He looked at the ring with an entirely different quality of attention, the stone in the setting, dark and smooth and fitted so precisely into the silver that he'd taken it for decorative. It was not decorative. It was the stone, remounted in the Lordship ring when the vault record was created, kept safe in the ring's setting for over a century, waiting. Dumbledore had known. The Black family object removed in 1992 wasn't the stone, it was something else, something Dumbledore had taken as a, what? A decoy? Evidence that the stone wasn't where Harry could find it accidentally. Or evidence he'd simply swept the vault for anything Black family related and taken the wrong thing. He didn't know it was in the ring, Harry said slowly. He was looking for the stone as a standalone object. He found something else Black family and took it, thinking, or he wasn't certain and took it to be safe, the ring was in the vault's deep holdings, Doria confirmed. The Lordship rings are held in the treaty-protected section, separate from the general vault. Accessible only by blood claim. Even with the Guardian Authority instrument, a non-Potter couldn't access the treaty holdings. Harry looked at his hand. At the dark stone in its silver setting, which had been sitting on his finger for 2 weeks containing one of the 3 Deathly Hallows. He sat back down. He looked at Doria. I need to tell someone about this. Yes, she agreed. But not publicly. Not yet. I would agree with that assessment as well. He picked up a quill and a piece of parchment and wrote 3 lines, folded it, and sent it with the house owl to Hermione's address. Then he sat back and looked at the mirror. Thank you, he said, to Doria's reflection. For waiting. "We're blacks," she said, with something in her expression that was warm in the very dry way of someone who had loved their family despite everything. "We're very good at waiting." Hermione arrived 40 minutes later with Ron, because she had apparently decided 40 minutes ago that anything Harry needed to tell her immediately was also something Ron needed to hear, which was correct. She came in already reading the note he'd sent and looked up at the mirror on the desk with sharp, immediate attention. "Who is that?" she said. "Doria Poternay Black." Magical impression embedded in the mirror's enchantment in 1958. Harry looked at Ron. "Sit down, both of you. This is going to take a while." He told them everything. The Evans lineage, the sacrificial resonance, the secondary effect, what it meant for his magical core, what it meant for why he'd survived the forest. Hermione was quiet in the precise, focused way she was when information was arriving faster than she could fully process it, and she was prioritizing capture over reaction. Ron went still in the way Ron went still when something hit him at the level of actual feeling rather than intellectual engagement. When Harry got to the stone, Ron said, "It's on your hand." "Yes." "You've been wearing it for 2 weeks." "Yes." Ron looked at the ring. At Harry's face. At the ring again. Do you feel anything different?" "Have you seen?" "No," Harry said. "I haven't tried to use it. I didn't know what it was." He paused. "I'm not sure I want to." Hermione looked up from the notes she'd been making. "The stone's function is to bring back shades," she said carefully. "Not real people, not true resurrection, shades. Reflections of the dead." She looked at him. "Doria's letter says it shows what's real. What you actually are." "She said it wasn't about the dead," Harry said. That was a story told to people who weren't ready for the truth." "Then what is it actually for?" Harry looked at the Peveril ring. Dark stone, oval, the symbol he'd known since he was 17. He thought about what it meant to be the last Peveril heir in the direct line. He thought about his mother and the sacrificial resonance in his core, about Doria's letter and the 3 aspects of mastery, about the cloak and the wand and the stone and what each one had actually taught him. He thought about the Elder Wand, currently back in Dumbledore's tomb where he'd returned it after the war. He'd made that choice at 18, walked to a tomb and put the wand down, and it had been the right choice, not dramatic, not heroic, just correct. He'd mastered power and let it go. He thought about the cloak. His father's cloak, in the chest upstairs, which he'd had since his first year and which was already woven into who he was so completely that it was difficult to separate the two. He looked at the stone. "I'll know when the right time is," he said. Hermione studied him. Then she nodded once, the nod she gave when she'd assessed a situation and reached the conclusion that Harry's instinct on it was sound. It was, he'd always thought, the most valuable nod she owned. "The item Dumbledore took from the vault in 1992, Ron said. He'd been quiet, working through the timeline. The Black family object. What was it?" Harry looked at Doria's reflection. The impression had gone still, dormant, not absent, in the way that some enchanted objects rested between conversations. "I don't know yet," Harry said. "It's not on the recovered list. It's one of the items Gringotts can't trace." He paused. "But I think I know someone who might know." Creature, when asked, needed no time to think. Harry had always found Creature's evolution over the years remarkable, from the bitter, neglected creature he'd first encountered to something more complex, still sharp-tongued and occasionally deeply difficult, but also, in the particular way of house elves, absolutely, foundationally loyal to the people he had chosen. He had chosen Harry. He maintained Grimmauld Place with the dedication of someone preserving a sacred trust and provided his opinions on Harry's life choices with the candor of someone who had no incentive to be flattering. Harry asked him in the kitchen, because that was where Creature preferred to be asked things, standing at the stove with something on the heat and one eye on whatever he was cooking. "The Black Mirror went to Hogwarts with Dumbledore," Harry said. "And Dumbledore also removed a Black family item from the Potter Vault in 1992. It's not on the recovered list. I'm wondering if Creature has any knowledge of the family's significant objects, what might have been passed to the Potter line through Doria. Creature turned from the stove and fixed Harry with the specific, sharp look he reserved for questions that deserved genuine engagement. Mistress Doria gave it to Master Fleamont directly, Creature said. 1963, when Mistress Doria knew she was dying. The Black family clock, not a clock for time, Master Harry. A clock for bloodline. It shows the state of every living member of a blood-connected family at any given moment. Harry looked at him. A bloodline clock. Ancient Black family magic. Shows every person connected by blood to the family, whether they are well, in danger, in conflict, lost. Creature's large eyes were steady and serious. If Master Fleamont was connected to the Black family through Doria, and if Lord Sirius was the last Black heir, and if Mistress Doria passed it to the Potter line for safekeeping, then in 1992, Harry said slowly, when Sirius had escaped Azkaban, or before that, when Dumbledore needed to know the state of the Black bloodline for his own reasons, he would have wanted the clock. Because it would show him where Sirius was. What state he was in. Hermione, who had followed Harry to the kitchen, made a sharp sound. He used it to track Sirius, she said. And anyone else connected to the Black bloodline, Harry said. Bellatrix. Narcissa. Everyone. He looked at Creature. Do you know where it is now? Creature does not know, the old elf said. But Creature knows where it was kept, in this house, before the Dumbledore man came and asked the late mistress for it. He paused, with the weight of a very old memory. Mistress Walburga gave it willingly. She believed Dumbledore was keeping it safe. She was not as foolish as people said, but she was foolish about that. She trusted him, Harry said. Everyone trusted him, Creature said, with the dry precision of someone stating a fact that contains an entire argument within it. He turned back to the stove. Harry stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then he went to the small writing desk in the corner and added Black bloodline clock to his list of outstanding items, and beside it wrote 1992, used to track Sirius. And circled it, and thought about what it meant that Dumbledore had needed to track Sirius, and what it meant that he'd ensured Sirius was in Azkaban in the first place. That was a thread he hadn't pulled yet. He was beginning to think the threads had no end. The formal inquiry hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. Harry spent the days between it and Sunday in the productive state he'd found himself in for the past 2 weeks, focused, methodical, moving through information with the particular clarity that comes from having a destination rather than a reaction. He read his mother's letters on Wednesday night. Alone, in the study, with the mirror dormant and the grimoire closed and the door shut. He sat at the desk and untied the green ribbon and went through them slowly, one by one, and let himself feel everything they asked him to feel without shortchanging any of it. She'd written to his father with the ease of two people who had known each other long enough to have a shared private language, references he didn't always understand, in-jokes that arrived without explanation, a texture of daily life that made them both suddenly, vividly real in a way that portraits and memories and other people's stories had never quite achieved. She wrote the way she apparently did everything, with intelligence and warmth and a directness that he recognized, with a start, in himself. There were 10 letters, spanning October of 1981. She'd written them during the weeks they were in hiding, and the Godric's Hollow address was on each one, and the last one was dated October 25th, 6 days before she died. That last one was the one he read 3 times. She wrote about Harry, about something he'd done that morning that had made her laugh, a small magic he'd done accidentally on a toy, the way his face had looked when the toy did something unexpected in response to him. She wrote about James and the way the hiding was affecting him, the particular way her husband chafed against stillness. She wrote about being afraid, and wrote it plainly, without euphemism, I am afraid, and I think that's correct, it would be stranger not to be, and then she wrote, at the end, about Harry again. He's going to be something, James. I don't know what exactly and I'm not going to pretend I do. But I look at him and there's something in him that's his own, already his own, completely, and he's not even 18 months. Whatever he does, whatever comes, it'll be his. That's what I want for him. Just that it's his. Harry sat with that for a long time. He thought about 22 lordships and 6 million galleons and 47 artifacts and 39 years. He thought about the grimoire and the mirror and the Peveril ring and the sacrificial resonance in his magical core. He thought about everything that had been held away from him, managed away from him, decided away from him for his entire life. He thought about walking into Gringotts 2 weeks ago and walking out with both folders under his arm, thinking clearly, deciding for himself where it all went next. It'll be his. That's what I want for him. Just that it's his. He refolded the letters and tied the ribbon back around them and put them in the drawer of his desk, not in the satchel, not in a vault. His desk, where he could reach them. Where they lived now. Then he picked up the Peveril ring and looked at the stone in its setting for a long moment, the dark oval, the ancient symbol, the weight of 3 generations of seeking and loss and misunderstanding of what the thing actually was. He thought about Doria's letter. The stone is a mirror. It shows you what is real. He held it for another moment. Then he put it back on his finger and went to make tea, because whatever came next it would come better if he'd slept, and before he slept he needed something warm, and some things were simply and perfectly that straightforward. He stood at the kitchen stove where Creature had been standing earlier and filled the kettle and listened to it heat and thought about his mother writing at a table in Godric's Hollow 6 days before she died, thinking about what she wanted for her son. The kettle boiled. He poured the tea. Outside, London moved in its ordinary way through the ordinary dark. Somewhere across the city, in a flat in Islington, Hermione was probably still up, cross-referencing something, building the case that would go to the inquiry on Thursday with the methodical, loving precision of someone who does their most important work for the people she loves. He thought about what Thursday would bring, and what came after Thursday, and the shape of the world that was assembling itself from all of this. He picked up his tea. He thought, mine. And it was. Chapter 6, Inheritance. Thursday arrived with the particular quality of days that have been building toward themselves for a long time, clear, cold, the kind of autumn morning that had no patience for ambiguity. Harry was up before 6, not because he was anxious but because his body had apparently decided that sleep was finished and there were better uses for the time. He made tea. He sat at the kitchen table with his mother's letters in the drawer upstairs and the grimoire on the shelf in the study and the Peveril ring warm on his finger, and he thought about what the day needed to be. The inquiry was different from the Wisengamot session. The session had been about establishing the legal record, making the facts public, getting the votes, ensuring that what had happened was formally acknowledged by the institution that governed the magical world. That was done. The inquiry was the next layer, the detailed examination of where the money had gone, who had known what accountability looked like for an institution like the Order of the Phoenix, and what remedies were legally available when the primary responsible party was dead. Harry had prepared for all of that. He was not, this morning, thinking about all of that. He was thinking about what came after. Because there would be an after, and he'd spent 2 weeks so focused on the immediate architecture of the legal proceedings that he'd been deliberately holding the after at arm's length, letting it develop on its own while he handled what was in front of him. Now it was in front of him, quietly, in the early morning kitchen, with the house settled around him and London barely awake outside. 22 lordships. Holdings in 3 countries. Seats in the Wisengamot. A family grimoire, a family mirror, his mother's letters, a ring containing the resurrection stone. An institutional acknowledgement that he had been wronged and a legal process to address it. All of it was his. He was thinking about what to do with his. The inquiry chamber was smaller than the full Wisengamot Hall, a semicircular room with a raised bench for the 5-member inquiry panel and a lower table for the presenting parties and their witnesses. The atmosphere was less ceremonial and more forensic, which suited Harry fine. He'd always been more comfortable in rooms where things were examined closely than in rooms where they were performed. Marchbanks was on the panel, which he'd expected. Kingsley had appointed the other 3 senior Wisengamot members with clean voting records on magical law matters, and 1 Goblin representative from Gringotts, which was unprecedented but legally sound under the 1865 Accord and which Kingsley had clearly insisted on. The Goblin was Ragnok. Harry caught this when he entered the room and processed it without reacting. Ragnok, as a panel member rather than a witness, had the full authority of the Goblin nation behind every question he asked. It was a statement. Kingsley had made it deliberately. Harry sat at the presenting table. Hermione was beside him, with 3 organized folders and the particular expression of someone who has prepared for every contingency and is quietly confident about it. Ron was in the gallery with Neville and Augusta Longbottom. McGonagall was there as well, front row, teaching robes, the small iron composure of a woman who has decided that bearing witness to difficult truths is part of what her life requires of her. Elphia's Doge was not present. Several Order members were, including Molly Weasley, who sat beside Ron with her hands folded and her face doing the complicated, difficult work of a woman who had loved Dumbledore with genuine devotion and was here today because her son had asked her to come and she did not, when it came to it, believe that love absolved anyone from the accounting. Harry had not expected Molly. When he'd seen her come in, something had moved in his chest, not sentimentality, exactly, but the recognition of something that cost her, and the specific warmth of a person showing up anyway. Marchbanks opened the session with the formal statement of purpose. The inquiry would examine the disposition of funds withdrawn from Potter family vaults between 1981 and 2002, assess the documentation of Order of the Phoenix operational expenditures against those funds, consider the question of Gringotts' institutional liability, and make recommendations for remedy and legal precedent. Then she looked at Harry and said, "Lord Potter, please present your opening statement." Harry stood. He thought, briefly, of the first time he'd stood in a room like this, the full Wizengamot at 15, on trial for using underage magic to save himself and Dudley from a Dementor. He'd been terrified then, though he hadn't entirely admitted it. He'd stood in the Ministry's vast courtroom and faced people in plum robes who had already decided what they thought, and he'd had Dumbledore arrive late and save him with procedural law, and he'd walked out acquitted. This time he'd arrived first. And he'd filed the procedural law himself. "I want to be clear about the purpose of this inquiry," he said. "I am not asking for punishment. I'm asking for an accounting, a complete, honest, publicly documented accounting of what was done with my family's money and why." He paused. Albus Dumbledore fought Grindelwald, led the Order of the Phoenix through 2 wars, and gave his life to the defeat of Voldemort. That is in the record and it will remain in the record. I am not attempting to remove it. He looked at the panel. What I am asking is that the same record also contain the truth about what he did with 39 years of access to my family's resources without my family's consent. Both things are true. The record needs to hold both. He sat down. Ragnok leaned forward on the panel. His amber eyes were steady. "Lord Potter, before we proceed with the financial documentation, I want to address a matter that the Goblin Nation considers foundational to this inquiry." He paused. "Gringotts failed in its treaty obligations to your family. I stated this at your initial consultation and I state it here, formally, on the record, before this panel. We permitted withdrawals under an inadequately verified instrument for 39 years. We did not flag the absence of Wizengamot countersignature. Whatever external pressure may have contributed to that failure," another precise pause, "the failure was ours. We acknowledge it fully. The Chamber absorbed this." A Goblin director making a formal admission of institutional failure in a public proceeding was, Harry suspected, something that had never happened before in the recorded history of the magical world. Ragnok sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who has said what needed saying and doesn't require anyone's reaction to it. "Thank you, Director," Harry said. "We will also," Ragnok continued, "be waiving all transaction fees and administrative charges associated with the Potter accounts for a period of 50 years, as partial acknowledgement of our failure." A pause. "Additionally, Gringotts will be creating a new internal protocol requiring Wizengamot countersignature verification for all guardianship instruments before any vault access is permitted. This protocol will apply to all accounts, regardless of the prestige or standing of the party presenting the instrument. Hermione wrote this down with barely contained satisfaction. The documentary portion of the inquiry took 4 hours. Harry and Hermione walked the panel through the complete Gringotts documentation with the methodical thoroughness of a case that had been prepared with care. The financial records, the artifact list, the guardian instrument, the 1979 vault access, the diverted estate income. For each item they had the primary Gringotts documentation, cross-referenced with ministry records where applicable and supplemented by the grimoire entries that established the historical context. The panel asked questions that were, on the whole, intelligent and engaged, particularly Ragnok, whose questions cut directly to the structural vulnerabilities in the authorization chain, and Marchbanks, who kept returning to the question of what precedent this set for future guardianship cases. 3 Order of the Phoenix members testified. Harry had reached out to them personally before the inquiry, which had surprised them but which had, he thought, been the right thing to do. They came in not as hostile witnesses but as people who were trying, imperfectly, to tell the truth about something they had complicated feelings about. Kingsley testified about the Order's operational structure. He confirmed that the Order had received significant funding through Dumbledore's personal allocation. He had believed at the time it was Dumbledore's own resources, which was what Dumbledore had told him. He had not known the source was the Potter vaults. His testimony had the quality of a man being honest at real personal cost, and the chamber recognized it. Arthur Weasley, who had joined the Order at 22 and remained a member through both wars, testified about specific safe house operations that had been funded through Dumbledore's allocations. He was precise, factual, and visibly uncomfortable, which Harry thought was appropriate and not unkind. He met Harry's eyes once during his testimony with an expression that carried more than words could manage, and Harry nodded once in response, and that was enough. The testimony that changed the tenor of the room came from a source Harry hadn't anticipated. Arabella Figg, who was 78 years old and had lived on Privet Drive as a squib neighbor to the Dursleys for the entirety of Harry's childhood, had written to Harry the day after the Wizengamot session. Her letter had been short and painful and entirely honest. Harry had read it twice and then driven to Surrey and sat in her cat-populated sitting room for 2 hours, and what she told him had made the artifact list and the gold feel, briefly, like secondary concerns. She testified about her role. Dumbledore had placed her on Privet Drive specifically to watch Harry, not to protect him in any active sense, but to observe and report. She had done this for 16 years. She had watched Harry grow up hungry and small and comprehensively unloved, and she had reported this to Dumbledore with increasing distress, and Dumbledore had told her, repeatedly, that the conditions of Harry's upbringing were necessary for the integrity of Lily's protection, that the protection anchored to blood, not comfort, and that Harry's circumstances, while difficult, were not something that could be changed without compromising the enchantment. She had believed him. She was not sure, she told the panel, that he had been entirely wrong about the enchantment mechanics. But she was sure, with the certainty of a woman who had spent 16 years watching a child through a window and done nothing, that wrong or right about the magic, the choice had cost Harry something that no amount of vault gold would compensate. The chamber was the specific kind of quiet that has weight. Harry sat through it with his hands flat on the table and his face steady. He wasn't going to fall apart in this room. He was going to let the record say what the record needed to say, and Arabella Figg saying it was better than him saying it, because she had been there and he had been 7 years old and those were not the same authority. But he felt it. He let himself feel it, quietly, behind the steady face, because it was his and he was done with not claiming his own things. When Figg finished, Marchbanks looked at Harry with an expression that had moved past controlled assessment into something more human, the face of a woman who has been a teacher and an examiner and a Wizengamot member for 70 years and has seen a great deal and is, today, genuinely appalled. "Lord Potter," she said. "I want to ask you directly. What remedy are you seeking from this inquiry?" Harry had thought about this question carefully. He'd written several versions of the answer and discarded them, and the one he'd arrived at was the simplest. 3 things, he said. A complete public record, everything documented here, available to any magical citizen who wishes to understand what happened and why. No redactions, no committee-managed summaries. The record as it is. He paused. The full financial remedy that Gringotts and the inquiry panel determine is appropriate. I won't specify an amount, that's for the process to determine, not for me to demand. Another pause. And a review of guardianship law. Not just protocol changes at Gringotts. A full Wisengamot review of how magical guardian authority is granted, verified, and monitored, so that what happened to my family cannot happen to another family's heir. He looked at the panel. That's it. That's what I want. Ragnok was looking at him with the amber eyes that assessed and tallied. Marchbanks had put her quill down. The three other panel members had various expressions that Harry catalogued and didn't particularly care about. No personal punitive measure sought. Marchbanks said. He's dead, Harry said simply. The record is what matters now. The panel's recommendations were issued on Friday morning, less than 24 hours after the inquiry closed, which suggested, Harry thought, that several members of the panel had gone home and written them that same night. Ragnok delivered the summary personally to Grimmauld Place, which was the second time in a month that the director of Gringotts had communicated with Harry directly rather than through intermediaries, and which Harry suspected would become a pattern. He read the recommendations at the kitchen table with Hermione and Ron. The financial remedy was set at 9 million galleons, the 6.8 million in documented losses, plus the 25-year compound interest calculation on the missing principal, plus a Goblin-assessed penalty under the 1865 Accord. The penalty portion would go partly to Harry and partly to a newly established fund for magical children in inadequate guardianship situations, which had been Ragnok's recommendation and which Harry had, in a brief note sent the night before the recommendations were issued, quietly endorsed. The public record requirement was accepted in full. The complete documentation would be archived in the Ministry's Public Records Office and the Hogwarts Library, specifically in the main library, not the restricted section, within 30 days. The guardianship law review was accepted and a committee formed, with one seat specifically designated for the heir of an ancient and noble house to serve as a standing member. Harry read the committee composition and noticed his own name on it and noted that he had not been asked before being assigned, which was both mildly annoying and entirely appropriate. He was, apparently, on a committee now. Ron read over his shoulder. Congratulations. You're a bureaucrat. Don't, Harry said. I'm just saying, you went in there to get the truth out and you came out with committee responsibilities. That's how they get you. The committee is for guardianship law reform, Hermione said, without looking up from the section she was annotating. It's genuinely important work. It's genuinely important work that meets on the second Tuesday of every month, Ron said. That's very different from fighting dark wizards. Good, Harry said. I've done enough of that. Neville came over that afternoon with the Macboon documentation and a bottle of something his grandmother had given him that turned out to be Scottish mead of significant vintage and considerable strength, and they sat in the Grimmauld Place kitchen, Harry and Neville and Hermione and Ron, in the kitchen of the house that had once been the most miserable place Harry could imagine and had become, incrementally and quietly over 2 years, something resembling a home, and they talked for a long time about what came next. Neville's 2 active Scottish lordship claims had been formally validated by the Wisengamot as a secondary item in the same session that had validated Harry's 22. The paperwork to transfer the associated holdings into Neville's name was being processed by Gringotts. Augusta Longbottom had apparently already begun writing letters to estate managers and tenant representatives with the thoroughness of a woman who had been waiting 40 years to write those particular letters. She's terrifying when she's pleased, Neville said, with the expression of a man who loves his grandmother and is also slightly afraid of her. She was always terrifying, Ron said. Being pleased just means it's aimed somewhere useful. What are you going to do with the holdings? Harry asked. Neville thought about it, turning his mead glass in his hands. The Scottish properties need work, some of them have been unoccupied for decades. I want to spend time there. Get to know them. A pause. I was thinking, actually, about the greenhouses. Harry looked at him. Your work greenhouses. The Macboon estate in Perthshire has about 80 acres of land that hasn't been cultivated in 30 years. The soil profile is, I looked it up, it's extraordinary. The magical residue from the old family wards has been breaking down into the ground for generations. He paused. It would be the best conditions I've ever had for the work I actually want to do. Growing things. Studying magical plant interaction with environmental magic. He shrugged, which was the Neville version of dismissing any suggestion that this was a small ambition. I'm not a politician. I don't want to sit in the Wisengamot every week. I want to grow things in extraordinary soil and maybe eventually publish something that changes how people understand magical plant ecology. Harry smiled. Then do that. You make it sound simple. It is simple. You know what you want and you have the means to do it. Harry looked at the ring on his hand. That's the whole point. That's what this was always supposed to be. Neville looked at him steadily. What are you going to do? The question had been sitting with Harry all week. He'd been answering the immediate questions, the legal ones, the procedural ones, the what do you need right now ones, and holding the larger question at a comfortable distance. Now, in the kitchen with the Mede and his friends and the evening coming down outside, it arrived fully. I don't know all of it yet, he said. But, the lordship seats in the Wisengamot. I'm going to use them. Not to be a politician, I'm with you on that, I have no interest in the politics for its own sake. But there are things in magical law that are wrong and I now have the standing to argue for changing them. He looked at Hermione. Starting with the Muggle-born registration law, which was supposedly repealed after the war but whose replacement has 3 provisions that are nearly as bad. Hermione's expression lit with the specific brightness she produced when someone had independently arrived at a conclusion she had been waiting for them to reach. I've been working on that analysis for months, she said. I know. I've been reading it. You didn't tell me you were reading it. I was reading it first. Now I'm telling you. He looked back at Neville. The Guardianship Committee. The estates, the French and German and Irish holdings need proper management and I need to understand what that means, which is going to take time and probably several trips. He paused. And Hogwarts. What about Hogwarts? Ron said. The grimoire was in the restricted section for 46 years. Misfiled. Not the only thing in that library that was put there because someone with authority decided access was inconvenient. Harry looked at his glass. I want to fund a proper archival review of the restricted section. Not a cull, an inventory. Understanding what's there and why. Some of it should stay restricted. Some of it shouldn't be there at all. Some of it probably belongs to families who don't know it exists. McGonagall would support that, Hermione said immediately. I know. I'm going to talk to her next week. He paused. She's a good headmistress. She deserves the resources to make Hogwarts what she thinks it can be. The kitchen was quiet for a moment in the comfortable way of a room full of people who are thinking rather than people who have nothing to say. You've been planning all of this, Ron said, not accusingly. With the recognition of a person who knows someone very well. This whole time. Not just the legal case. The legal case was clearing the ground, Harry said. You clear the ground before you build. Ron looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded, the chess player's nod, I see the board, and I see where this is going, and the move is correct. The mirror's secondary activation happened 3 weeks later. Harry had come to understand Doria's impression in the mirror the way you come to understand any unusual relative, gradually, with patience, through conversations that were sometimes illuminating and sometimes frustrating and occasionally very funny. She had opinions about everything and delivered them with the angular honesty of the Black family at its most functional. She liked Hermione immediately and comprehensively. She found Ron's directness refreshing in a way that she expressed as mild surprise, which Ron found both insulting and flattering in equal measure. She called Neville the gardening lord, which Neville accepted as an accurate description and therefore didn't mind. She and Creature had a complicated relationship. They had apparently known each other in life, and the combination of a magical impression and a very old house elf who remembered Doria Black vividly resulted in conversations conducted half in gobbledygook, half in English, entirely on terms that Harry did not follow but chose not to interrupt. The secondary activation was different from the ordinary mirror conversations. Harry was alone in the study when it happened, early morning, before anyone else was awake, the kind of quiet that only existed at 5 a.m. in a London house. He was sitting with the Peveril ring in his open palm, not wearing it, just holding it, thinking about Doria's letter and what she'd written about the stone. The mirror's surface shifted. Not to Doria's impression, to something else. A different quality of light. Deeper, the way still water is deeper than moving water. Harry looked at it. The reflection showed him himself, exactly as he was, sitting in the chair in the early morning study, which was not what mirrors showed under these circumstances, he knew, and he waited. The reflection did not change. It just clarified. Like a lens coming into focus. His face, his hands, the ring in his palm, the rings on his finger, the grimoire on the shelf behind him. Everything exactly as it was. And then, without any change in the image, something shifted in the quality of the seeing, not what he was looking at but what he understood about it. The reflection showed him himself and in doing so showed him the truth of what he was looking at, which was, a 20-year-old man in a study in the early morning, holding a stone that had driven men to ruin and obsession for centuries, surrounded by the evidence of his inheritance and the work he'd decided to do with it, and not afraid of any of it. Not performing bravery. Not managing fear into something functional. Simply not afraid. The mirror went still. His own face looked back at him, ordinary and clear-eyed. He held the stone in his palm for another moment. He thought about his parents, not grief, not longing, just the clean, real thought of them. Lily writing at a table in Godric's Hollow. James with his easy confidence and his love for Lily in the grimoire. People who had lived and died and left, among other things, this. He turned the ring over. He slid it back onto his finger. He did not use the stone to call shades. He didn't need to. The mirror had shown him what the stone actually did, which was what Doria had said it did, showed you what was real. And what was real was that he was here, and they were in him, in the sacrificial resonance in his core, in the grimoire on the shelf, in the letters in his drawer, and none of that required a shade, a reflection, an echo. It required him. Living. Moving. Building the things his mother had said she wanted for him. It'll be his. Just that it's his. He stood up. He went to the kitchen and started the kettle and stood at the window watching London come slowly awake in the grey early light, and when Creature appeared to start breakfast Harry said, "I was thinking, the dining room. I want to stop eating in the kitchen." Creature gave him a look of profound satisfaction that Harry suspected had been waiting since he first moved into the house. "The dining room requires restoration." "I know. Let's restore it. It will take several weeks." "I'm not in a hurry," Harry said. "I live here." Creature considered this statement with the gravity it deserved, seemed to reach a conclusion about its significance, and began making considerably more elaborate preparations for breakfast than usual. The last conversation with Dumbledore's portrait happened on a Saturday in November. Harry had gone back to Hogwarts twice since the inquiry, once to deliver the formal Wisengamot order regarding the library archival project to McGonagall, and once to oversee the recovery of 2 more artifacts that the castle inventory had located. Both visits had been practical and relatively brief, and both times he had not gone to the headmaster's office. He went on a Saturday because the castle was quieter on weekends and because he had decided, somewhere in the 3 weeks since the inquiry, that the conversation needed to happen. Not for legal reasons, everything legal had been addressed. For his own reasons. McGonagall met him at the gate and walked with him to her office and then, when he asked if she minded leaving him alone for a while, stepped out without asking why and closed the door behind her with a quiet deliberateness that was one of the most considerate things anyone had done for him in recent memory. The portrait was there. Dumbledore's painted figure, in his painted chair, the half-moon glasses, the silver beard. The familiar weight of a presence that Harry had spent 7 years navigating and 1 war completing and the last month systematically examining. They looked at each other. "The inquiry is done," Harry said. He sat down in the chair across from the desk, not at the desk, across from it, which felt correct. "You've seen the recommendations, I imagine." "I have," the portrait said. "And?" A pause. "The painted fire. The dormant spinning instruments. And I think the remedy is just," the portrait said. "The guardianship review particularly. That should have existed long before me." Harry looked at him. At the intelligence in those painted features, the familiarity of the expression, and at the thing he'd been carrying since the first conversation in this room, which was the knowledge that the person he was looking at had loved him. Had, in the complicated and costly way of people who love causes as much as they love the people in them, genuinely loved him. "I've been trying to work out," Harry said, "what to do with all of it. Not the money and the legal process, that's handled. What to do with you." He paused. "With what you were to me." The portrait was quiet. "You were my teacher and my guide and the person I trusted most for most of my life," Harry said. "You were also someone who planned my life from before I was old enough to know a plan was being made. Both of those things are true and I've stopped trying to make them cancel each other out." He looked at the painted hands, folded. "What I've decided is, you were what you were. The whole of it. I'm not going to make you only the hero or only the architect of the plans I didn't know about. You were both, and that's what the record shows, and that's what I'm going to remember." The portrait looked at him with an expression that carried, with the eerie accuracy of good portrait enchantment, the genuine weight of feeling. "That is more generous than I deserve," it said. "It's not generous," Harry said. "It's just true. I don't owe you generosity. I owe myself clarity." He stood. "The Guardianship Committee starts in January. The Muggleborn Law Review is in February. I've got meetings with the French Ministry in December about the Peveril Allied Lordship claims there." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "There's a lot to do." "Yes," the portrait said. "There always is." Harry moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back one more time, at the room that had contained so much of his education and his management and his life, and felt, for the first time in this room, nothing complicated. Just the room. Just him. "I read my mother's letters," he said. The portrait went very still. "She was remarkable," Harry said simply. "You knew that." "I did," the portrait said. Quietly. "She wanted her son to own his life." He looked at the portrait directly. "I'm doing that now." He walked out. The 22nd Lordship ring activated on a Tuesday in early December. It was the German one, the blood adoption claim from 1678, which had required the longest verification process because the documents were partially in archaic German and partially in a magical script that had taken Gringotts' archival team 3 weeks to fully translate. When Sharpfang sent the confirmation that it was ready, Harry went to Gringotts on his own, just him, early in the morning before anyone else was about. He sat in the small black stone room with the stone pedestal, and Sharpfang placed the last ring in front of him, thin, dark metal, almost black, the one he'd remembered from the first claiming session for the way it absorbed light rather than reflecting it. He picked it up. The pulse was different from the others. Not gold, not violet, something he had no color for, a deep resonance that moved through him from his feet to the crown of his head and took several seconds to complete, during which he sat very still and let it happen. When it faded he felt the particular sensation of 22 claims being simultaneously active for the first time, a warm, deep, layered weight that was nothing like the exhaustion or oppression he'd imagined it might be. It was more like standing on ground that had settled completely. He slid the ring onto his finger alongside the others and looked at his right hand. 22 Lordship rings. The sum of 400 years of family history and a month of reclamation and a life that had, until very recently, belonged largely to someone else's plan. He flexed his fingers. The rings caught the warm light of the old lanterns in the underground room. They were not performing themselves, not announcing anything. They were just there, exactly as they were, because they had always been his and were now, formally and permanently and publicly, acknowledged as such. He went home. Christmas at the Burrow that year was, as it had been since Harry was 12 years old, a particular kind of abundant chaos, people in every room, food arriving at the table in improbable quantities, conversations happening at 3 different volumes simultaneously, the twins' absence a permanent ache that everyone carried quietly alongside the noise. Harry arrived with Hermione and Ron, which was how he'd arrived at the Burrow every year since 5th year, and was met at the door by Molly Weasley, who hugged him the way she always hugged him, entirely, with both arms, for several seconds longer than strictly necessary, and then pulled back and looked at him with the expression of a mother taking stock. "You look different," she said. "Same as always," Harry said. "No you don't." She looked at him carefully. "You look settled." He thought about that. About 22 rings and his mother's letters and a dining room being restored in Grimmauld Place and a guardianship committee starting in January and a world that was, imperfectly and gradually, being turned towards something better. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." She held his face in both hands for a moment, the way she had at 16 when he'd walked in from the garden and she'd simply done it without preamble or explanation, and it had meant the same thing now as it had then: "You are claimed, you are loved, you belong somewhere." "Good," she said. "And let him in." The evening was exactly what it was, warm and loud and alive with the particular, irreplaceable quality of people who have been through terrible things together and have arrived, despite everything, at a table full of food and a fire and each other. Arthur held court about something Muggle he'd found. Ginny was home from the Harpies' winter break and had already won 2 arguments by the time Harry got through the door. George sat next to an empty chair with Fred's name in it that no one acknowledged directly and everyone honored constantly. Harry sat between Ginny and Neville, who had brought his grandmother, and across from Hermione and Ron, and ate Molly Weasley's cooking, which remained the best food he had ever experienced in his life, and thought about everything and nothing and mostly just let it be what it was. After dinner, when the table had been cleared and the kitchen reorganized and half the family had migrated to various comfortable locations around the house, Harry ended up on the back step, his particular preference at the Burrow, the step that looked out over the garden that was always slightly wild and always perfectly itself. Ginny came and sat beside him, because she had a talent for being where Harry was without requiring any particular acknowledgement of this from him, which was one of the things he'd always appreciated about her. They'd been careful with each other, in the 2 years since the war. Honest. Testing the ground. The thing between them had always been real and was still real and had, in the past 2 months specifically, been becoming something more deliberately chosen. He'd been thinking about that. About choosing things, which was the theme of the past month of his life assembled in one place. "Gran Longbottom asked me 3 times at dinner whether you were seeing anyone," Ginny said. "What did you tell her?" "That it wasn't my place to say." A pause. She seemed unsatisfied. "She seems unsatisfied as a general condition." "She does." Ginny looked at the garden. "Neville says she lights up in the mornings now. Reading letters from the Perthshire estate managers." "Good. He's happy," Ginny said. "Properly happy. That thing you gave him, I didn't give him anything. Gringotts found it. I just made sure he knew. You went to him and told him personally instead of letting a letter do it. You brought him to the Wisengamot with you. You made sure his claims were part of the record alongside yours when you could have filed separately." She looked at him, and her eyes were her mother's, direct, warm, taking stock. "That's giving him something." Harry thought about that. He didn't deny it, because it was true. "I'm going to Paris in December," he said. "The French ministry, for the lordship meetings." "I know. Ron told me. I thought I might, if you had time, and wanted to." "Yes," Ginny said. He hadn't finished the sentence. She had, with the comfortable certainty of a person who had always been 2 steps ahead of him in specific ways that he found both slightly annoying and deeply right. "I haven't actually asked yet," he said. "You were going to ask me to come to Paris." "I was. And I said yes." "You did." She leaned her shoulder against his. "You're going to be insufferable about the 22 lordships eventually, you know. Once the novelty wears off of being responsible about it, you're going to accidentally mention it in conversation at least twice a week." "I am not going to, Harry. I say this with love. You grew up with nothing and someone just gave you everything. You are going to bring it up in conversations where it's not relevant and then catch yourself and feel embarrassed." He opened his mouth to protest and then, honestly, couldn't entirely rule it out. "Maybe," he said. "That's nearly an admission." She stood up, brushing off her jeans. "Come back inside. Mom made something for pudding that I'm not going to describe because you need to experience it fresh." He stood. The garden was silver and dark behind them, the borough lit warm at its windows, voices and laughter and the particular music of people who belonged to each other. He thought about his mother writing, "It'll be his." He thought about the Wisengamot chamber and Ragnok's amber eyes and Marchbanks reading 22 names into the record. He thought about the grimoire on his shelf and the letters in his drawer and the mirror with Doria's impression and creature restoring the dining room with tremendous personal satisfaction. He thought about Paris in December and a guardianship committee in January and 80 acres of extraordinary soil in Perthshire where Neville was going to grow things that changed how people understood the world. He thought about all of it and what it amounted to. He went back inside. The door closed behind him on the cold dark garden, and the warmth of the borough wrapped around him, the noise and the light and the food and the people, and he stood in the hallway of the most homelike place he'd known for most of his life and felt, in the deepest and most uncomplicated part of himself, exactly what he was. Home. His. Here. Not because someone had planned it for him or positioned him toward it or decided it was the correct destination for the piece they were moving across the board. Just because he'd walked in the door. The Gringotts public record of the ancient Goblin Treaty audit, case reference 974, HP 001, was archived in the Ministry's Public Records Office on the 15th of December, and in the Hogwarts Library on the same day, where it was filed correctly and accessibly and would remain available to anyone who wished to understand what had happened, and what it had cost, and what had been reclaimed from it. The Guardianship Law Review Committee convened for the first time on the second Tuesday of January, and the man who sat in the ancient and noble house seat arrived exactly on time, with excellent notes, and no patience whatsoever for the idea that the law was not for everyone. The dining room at Grimmauld Place was completed in February, and was, according to everyone invited to its first proper dinner, exactly right.